Bro, it's got hands. What the hell is that? Oh my god.
In today's video, we feature the most clear Bigfoot footage ever filmed on camera. From a field biologist deep in a remote forest tracking an albino Bigfoot to a series of trail camera recordings that begin capturing Bigfoot taking hikers one after another over the course of 2 days. I'm a 36-year-old field biologist taking short-term assignments documenting wildlife in remote areas whenever conservation groups need extra help. Most jobs end with a report explaining why a bear, elk, or mountain lion was mistaken for something else. The survey area covered a little over 12 square miles of dense forest that had produced nearly a dozen reports over the previous 8 months. The reports came from experienced hikers, hunters, and a pair of forestry workers who had all described roughly the same thing despite never speaking to one another. That's usually a good sign that there's at least something worth investigating. Most assignments like this end with a perfectly reasonable explanation, but every now and then you get one that keeps refusing to fit neatly into a box. Before doing any hiking, I marked every reported sighting on my GPS and picked out the locations that made the most sense for trail cameras. By early afternoon, I'd set up 5 cameras along game trails, creek crossings, and one narrow ridgeline where several witnesses claimed the white animal had crossed. I found plenty of deer tracks, a few black bear prints, and enough elk signs to explain why so many predators passed through the area. Around sunset, I climbed onto a rocky overlook that gave me a clear view of a small meadow below. It was exactly the kind of place a large animal might cross before dark. I spent nearly an hour behind the camera without seeing anything unusual and was already thinking about heading back to camp when something caught my eye near the tree line. A large white figure stepped into the opening and continued walking across the meadow at an unhurried pace. It never stopped, never looked around, and disappeared into the trees on the opposite side less than 10 seconds later. The footage wasn't nearly clear enough to identify what I'd just recorded, but it definitely wasn't what I'd expected to find out there. Back at camp, I transferred the footage onto my laptop and zoomed in, frame by frame. The distance made it hard to pick out details, but one thing stood out immediately. The shoulders looked far too broad for a deer, and the way it moved didn't remind me of any bear I'd ever studied. It also didn't look like a person wearing white clothing, which ruled out the explanation I had been hoping for. I watched the clip several more times before comparing it with the witness reports I'd been given. Nearly all of them placed the sightings within a mile of where I'd been standing that evening. Whatever I'd filmed had followed the same route people had been describing for months. That was enough for me to extend the survey. I emailed the conservation group and told them I'd be extending the survey by a few days. At that point, all I expected to send back was better footage of an animal nobody had managed to identify yet. I reset my alarm for before sunrise, swapped out every battery I could, and planned to check the trail cameras first thing in the morning. The real work was just beginning. I left camp before sunrise and checked on the trail cameras. At 5:43 that morning, a large white figure entered the frame from the left and crossed the trail at a steady pace before disappearing into the trees less than 5 seconds later. It never paused or acknowledged the camera. The footage still wasn't clear enough to identify what I'd recorded, but it confirmed one important thing. Whatever this animal was, it had already passed through the survey area twice in less than 24 hours. That meant I finally had a pattern to work with. I spent the rest of the morning following the creek where the second camera had captured the white figure. The banks were soft enough to hold tracks, and before long, I found exactly what I'd been hoping for. I followed them upstream until the trees opened into a shallow crossing. That's where I saw it again. The white figure stepped into the water and crossed at an easy pace, giving me several uninterrupted seconds to film before disappearing into the timber on the opposite bank. I remember forcing myself not to adjust the zoom too much. One sudden movement was all it would take to lose the shot. Whatever I was filming never looked in my direction. It crossed the creek at an easy pace, climbed the opposite bank, and disappeared into the trees as quietly as it had arrived. I stood there for another minute, with the camera still pointed at the empty crossing, almost expecting it to come back. At the time, I thought that would end up being the most interesting footage I'd bring home. It wasn't even close. Back at camp, I started crossing possibilities off the list one by one. It wasn't a bear. The shoulders were too narrow, the legs were too long, and bears simply don't move with that kind of upright stride for more than a few steps. It wasn't a person either. The arms extended well below the waist, the body proportions were completely wrong, and no one wearing a costume could have crossed that rocky creek bed so effortlessly. Like everyone else, I'd heard the stories about Bigfoot over the years, but I never imagined I'd be sitting in my tent trying to explain an albino one. Albinism occurs in mammals, even if it's extremely rare, and there was no biological reason an undiscovered primate couldn't have the same condition. After ruling out every explanation that made sense, only one possibility fit what I was seeing. I was looking at an albino Bigfoot, and if I was right, it was one of the rarest animals anyone had ever recorded. Figuring out what it was felt like the biggest breakthrough of the trip. It turned out to be one of the least surprising things I would discover that week. I must have watched the footage 20 times before finally shutting the laptop. Every time I thought I'd found something that proved I was wrong, another detail pushed me back to the same conclusion. By the time I went to sleep, I wasn't trying to figure out what it was anymore. I was trying to figure out how to find it again. Knowing albinism can make animals more sensitive to bright sunlight gave me a place to start. If this thing shared even some of the same traits, it would probably spend more time under thick forest cover than out in the open. Instead of waiting near the meadow where I'd first seen it, I moved to a shaded creek crossing that stayed protected by the trees for most of the day. I also set up a small camouflage blind overlooking the area and switched to a longer lens so I could film from a distance without disturbing it. The waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Hours went by without so much as a squirrel wandering into frame, and I started wondering if I'd completely misread the area. Then, late that afternoon, movement caught my eye. The albino Bigfoot stepped out of the timber and walked straight through the crossing. I was thrilled with those recordings. If someone had told me I'd barely remember them by the end of the week, I never would have believed it. It never looked in my direction and seemed completely unaware I was there. I stayed in the blind for another hour hoping it'd come back, but it never did. Sitting inside that blind, I honestly felt like I'd finally figured it out. If the rest of the assignment went this smoothly, this might end up being a pretty good anniversary present for my wife after all. I backed up every clip onto a second memory card before turning in for the night. Losing a week's worth of footage because of a corrupted file would have been embarrassing enough. Losing what might have been the first convincing recording of an albino Bigfoot would have been even worse. I remember falling asleep thinking the hard part was finally behind me. After that, I stopped waiting for the albino Bigfoot to come to me and started following it instead. Every encounter lasted a little longer than the one before. It never ran, but it never stood still long enough for me to get close either. Whenever I thought I was about to lose sight of it, the white figure would appear again farther up the trail or between another stand of trees, almost as if it wanted to make sure I didn't turn around. More than once, I considered heading back to camp, but every new glimpse convinced me to keep going just a little farther. Looking back, that was probably the first mistake I made. At the time, though, it felt like progress. The longer I kept it in view, the better my chances of documenting behavior no one had ever recorded before. I had no reason to think I was doing exactly what the albino wanted. One encounter stood out more than all the others. I had stopped beside a fallen tree to steady my camera and crouched lower so I wouldn't lose sight of the albino through the brush. A few seconds later, it slowed down, turned slightly, and lowered itself into almost the same posture. I figured it was a coincidence until I started moving again. Instead of walking straight ahead, I stepped around the fallen trunk to get a better angle. The albino continued another few yards before circling around a different fallen tree in almost the same way. It wasn't copying me exactly, but the similarities were hard to ignore. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince myself I was reading too much into it. Animals often mirror each other's behavior without any deeper meaning. Still, that explanation became harder to believe every time I replayed the footage. Something about the way it reacted felt less instinctive and far more deliberate. I remember sitting on a fallen log before heading back to camp and replaying that clip over and over. I'd spent years studying animal behavior, and I knew how easy it was to mistake coincidence for intelligence. The problem was that the more I watched, the harder it became to convince myself that was all I'd seen. The next morning, I made my usual rounds to check the trail cameras. Most of them had captured the same wildlife they'd been recording all week, but one clip immediately caught my attention. The albino Bigfoot walked into frame carrying a thick dead branch nearly twice its height. It wasn't dragging it behind or using it to clear a path. It carried the branch with both hands, crossed the trail, and disappeared into the trees without stopping. I replayed the clip several times, trying to figure out what I'd just watched. Large primates have been known to use branches as tools or even carry nesting material, so I didn't think much of it at first. I simply assumed I'd recorded another behavior that hadn't been documented before. I marked the exact time, camera number, and location in my notebook. If it happened again, I wanted to know whether there was a pattern. I copied the footage onto my laptop, replaced the camera's batteries, and headed back into the forest, still wondering where it had taken that branch. Later that afternoon, I found the albino again near the edge of a small clearing. I stayed well back and filmed through the trees, hoping to avoid pushing my luck. It seemed to tolerate my presence for a few minutes, but the moment I took a few careful steps closer, everything changed. The forest suddenly went quiet. Even the birds that had been calling all afternoon stopped at once. I remember thinking the silence felt wrong. Then the albino stopped walking, bent down, and grabbed a thick dead limb lying on the forest floor. In one motion, it swung the branch into the trunk of a nearby tree with enough force to split it clean in two. The crack echoed through the forest. It didn't charge or run. It simply stood there, watching me. Every instinct I had told me I'd crossed a line I wasn't supposed to cross. I kept the camera rolling for another few seconds, slowly backed away without taking my eyes off it, and didn't stop until there were several hundred yards between us. It was the first time since arriving that I felt less like I was documenting wildlife, and more like I'd just been warned. I honestly thought that would end up being the most intimidating thing I captured. But it wasn't. I seriously considered ending the assignment right there. I even started packing a few things around camp before talking myself out of it. The scientist in me kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation for what I'd witnessed. Curiosity won, and by the next morning, I was back out checking cameras again. The warning stayed in the back of my mind for the rest of the day, so I decided to check the trail cameras before heading back to camp. Most of them were uneventful, but one clip made me stop. The albino Bigfoot walked into frame carrying a heavy log across its shoulder before disappearing into the trees again. That raised a question I couldn't answer. Why was it carrying logs? It wasn't building a nest. It wasn't eating. It wasn't clearing a trail either. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping I'd missed something, but the clip ended before it reached its destination. Combined with the branch I'd seen the day before, it no longer felt like an isolated behavior. Whatever it was doing, it seemed deliberate. I just couldn't figure out the purpose yet. At the time, I assumed I was documenting. Another unusual behavior. I had no idea those few seconds of trail camera footage would eventually become some of the most important evidence from the entire expedition. My plan stopped working almost overnight. The shaded creek crossing that had produced my most promising footage stayed completely empty, and none of the trails I'd been following showed any fresh sign of the albino. I moved between every camera hoping it had simply changed its route, but they all came back with the same result. Nothing. That made me wonder if I'd gotten lucky, or if the albino had noticed the pattern before I did. Either way, I couldn't keep waiting in the same place anymore. If I wanted more footage, I'd have to start looking for it again instead of expecting it to come to me. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving cameras to new game trails and swapping memory cards. If the albino had changed its routine, I'd have to change mine too. Part of me wondered if I was giving the animal too much credit. Maybe I'd simply been lucky during those first few days, and now I was chasing patterns that didn't really exist. It wouldn't be the first time a field assignment had humbled me. I found it again the following afternoon, but this encounter only left me with more questions. The albino wasn't alone long enough for me to film anything unusual, but one of the trail cameras I collected that evening filled in the missing piece. It showed the albino walking through with several large rocks cradled against its chest before disappearing off the edge of the frame. Now I'd recorded it, logs and rocks, on 3 separate occasions. That wasn't something animals normally did without a reason. For a second, I actually wondered if it was building me a bench so we could sit down, share a drink, and talk about life. As ridiculous as that sounded, I couldn't come up with a better explanation. Whatever it was making, it clearly wasn't finished yet. Over the next 2 days, I kept seeing the same thing. Every time I checked a trail camera, the albino seemed to be carrying something different. One clip showed another heavy branch. Another captured it dragging a smaller log across the forest floor. A third ended just as it disappeared behind the trees with what looked like a pile of loose rocks. None of the cameras ever showed where it was taking any of it. They always stopped recording first. One clip showed it dragging another heavy log uphill with both hands before disappearing behind a stand of fir trees. Another captured it carrying several smaller branches tucked beneath one arm while balancing what looked like a flat rock in the other. Just like every recording before it, the footage ended a few seconds too early. I even hiked in the direction it had gone a few times, expecting to find some kind of shelter or nesting site, but there was nothing there. I even compared the timestamps from each camera, hoping they'd point to the same general area. Instead, they only confirmed that the albino was covering an incredible amount of ground between recordings. However it was moving through the forest, it knew the terrain far better than I ever could. By the 5th day, I finally caught another break. Fresh tracks led away from one of the creek crossings, and this time they hadn't been washed out overnight. I followed them carefully until I spotted the albino moving through the trees less than 50 yards ahead. It was the closest I'd ever been. I raised the camera and stayed exactly where I was, hoping not to repeat the mistake I'd made a few days earlier. I expected it to disappear the moment it noticed me. Instead, it glanced in my direction and kept walking at exactly the same pace. Not faster, not slower, almost as if it had already decided how close it was willing to let me get. Instead of disappearing into the forest like it usually did, the albino took a few slow steps to the side and waited. Once I started moving again, it did the same, always staying just far enough ahead to remain in sight. I should have turned around right then. Instead, I convinced myself I was finally documenting behavior nobody had ever recorded before. So I followed, careful to keep my distance, while the albino quietly led the way. Looking back, that's probably the moment the assignment stopped being mine. I thought I was deciding where to go next because I still had the camera in my hands. The reality was a lot less comforting. Every decision I made after that was based on wherever the albino wanted me to look. I didn't make it much farther before I noticed something else was wrong. I pulled out my GPS to mark the latest sighting and immediately realized I was several miles from camp. I'd been so focused on keeping the albino in view that I hadn't paid much attention to where it had been taking me. The quickest way back meant retracing my steps, so I turned around and started hiking in that direction. I hadn't gone more than 10 minutes when I froze. Standing on the trail ahead was the albino. It wasn't making any threatening movements. It simply stood there, watching me. I waited for it to leave, but it didn't. After a few minutes, I decided to take a different route instead. At the time, I told myself it was just another coincidence. Looking back, I don't think it was trying to stop me. I think it was waiting to see whether I'd choose the path it wanted. The alternate route lasted less than an hour. Just as I reached another narrow game trail, the albino stepped out from behind a cluster of cedars and stopped again. Different trail, same result. That's when I stopped believing it was coincidence. It wasn't following me from a distance, and it wasn't wandering through the forest at random. Somehow, it kept appearing exactly where I intended to go next. I backed away without taking my eyes off it and looked for a third route instead. The farther I walked, the quieter the forest seemed to become. Even the birds had gone silent. I told myself I was overthinking it, but one question kept coming back. If the albino already knew where I was going, where exactly was it trying to keep me from reaching? I spent the next half hour trying to work around it, but every route I picked seemed to funnel me back toward the same section of forest. The albino didn't appear every time, but it appeared often enough that I finally stopped pretending there wasn't a pattern. Then another trail camera gave me something else to think about. Earlier that afternoon, before I packed it away, it had recorded the albino dragging another long log in exactly the same direction as the others. It wasn't wandering while carrying those branches, rocks, and logs. It had a destination. Standing there with the camera in one hand and my GPS in the other, I couldn't shake a question that suddenly felt a lot more important than what the albino was building. Why was it spending so much time preparing one specific part of the forest? I stopped walking and listened. The forest had gone quiet again. No birds, no squirrels moving through the brush, just the wind pushing through the trees. I'd spent enough years working outdoors to know that kind of silence usually meant something nearby had every other animal on edge. Whether it was a mountain lion, a bear, or the albino, I wasn't interested in finding out which one. That was my cue to stop pretending this was just another survey. As much as I wanted to finish the assignment, I had a wife waiting at home and an anniversary I'd rather not miss. I also wasn't too excited about becoming the guy whose obituary read, contracted field biologist, killed while chasing a giant white ape through the woods. Search and rescue confirmed they had my location and told me to stay exactly where I was while they sent a helicopter. At that point, whatever happened to the albino after that could be someone else's job. I found a small clearing and settled in to wait. There wasn't much else I could do until the helicopter arrived. After a few minutes, I started looking around more carefully, mostly to keep myself occupied. That's when I noticed something that hadn't registered before. Several fallen logs had been dragged into places that felt odd. A few large rocks were stacked along one side of the clearing, while thick branches filled gaps between clusters of trees. None of it looked unnatural on its own, but together it seemed strangely organized. I walked a slow circle around the area, and the more I looked, the less random it felt. There was really only one easy way in and one easy way out. Every other direction was cluttered with logs, brush, or rocks that forced you back toward the same narrow opening. Then I remembered every trail camera clip I'd collected over the last few days. The branches, the logs, the rocks. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what the albino had been carrying and started wondering where it had wanted me to end up. I walked the perimeter one more time, hoping I'd notice something that proved I was overreacting. I didn't. If anything, every step made the layout feel more intentional than the last. I backed up a few steps and looked at the clearing again, this time as if I were seeing it for the first time. The layout suddenly made sense. The logs hadn't fallen there naturally, the rocks weren't scattered at random, and the branches weren't just piled together. They had narrowed the area until there was only a single opening wide enough to move through comfortably. If someone, or something, walked into the clearing from the wrong direction, every other path forced them back toward that same gap. It wasn't a cage. I could still climb over the logs or push through the brush if I had to. It would just take time, more time than anyone would want if something was standing between them and the only easy way out. Then another thought hit me. Every encounter over the past few days had pulled me farther from camp and closer to this exact part of the forest. The albino hadn't been wandering. It had been leading me here. The branches, the logs, and the rocks suddenly meant something very different, piece by piece, day after day, right in front of my cameras, and I'd spent almost a week asking the wrong question. It had been building this, so much for sharing a drink and talking about life. Whatever the albino had been building, it definitely wasn't a bench. I stayed exactly where search and rescue had told me to, but the albino didn't leave. Every few minutes, I'd catch another glimpse of white moving between the trees before it disappeared again. It never came any closer, but it never wandered far either. The longer I watched, the more it felt like it was waiting for me to make the first move. Every instinct told me to stay put. If I walked back into the trees, I'd be doing exactly what it had spent the last several days trying to get me to do. So I kept the camera rolling and waited. For the first time since this assignment began, I wasn't trying to find the albino anymore. I was hoping the helicopter would find me first. Those next several minutes felt longer than the previous 5 days combined. Every rustle in the trees made me glance up from the camera, expecting the albino to step into the clearing again. Eventually, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. At first, it was just a faint thumping somewhere beyond the mountains, but it grew louder with every passing second. The rescue helicopter circled once before spotting the clearing and lowering a rescue line. Relief hit me almost immediately. I clipped into the harness, kept my camera in one hand, and gave the crew a thumbs up. As I started rising above the trees, I instinctively pointed the camera back toward the clearing. If the albino was still nearby, this would be my last chance to film it. I had no idea those next few seconds would produce the clearest and easily the most disturbing footage of the entire assignment. The helicopter had barely settled into position when the albino finally stepped out from the trees. It wasn't looking at me anymore. Its attention was fixed entirely on the aircraft overhead. The constant noise immediately changed its behavior. It began pacing along the edge of the clearing, snapping branches beneath its feet and glancing up every few seconds. Then the searchlight swept across the trees and caught it in full view. The moment the beam reached the albino, it flinched, turned its head away from the light, and retreated several steps beneath the canopy. A few moments later, it cautiously stepped back into the clearing, only to retreat again as the spotlight passed over it. Watching the footage later, that was the first time I'd ever seen the albino lose its composure. For the first time since I arrived, the albino wasn't the one controlling what happened next. As the helicopter lifted me above the treetops, I kept the camera pointed toward the clearing below. From the ground, everything had looked like a mess of fallen timber and scattered rocks. From the air, it looked completely different. The logs, branches, and rock piles formed a narrow funnel that led into the exact spot where I'd been waiting. From above, I could even make out the alternate routes I'd tried taking earlier. They all narrowed into the same opening, blocked by the very logs and rock piles I'd spent days watching the albino carry through the forest. Every trail camera clip I'd collected over the past few days suddenly made sense. The albino hadn't been carrying those materials at random. It had been shaping the landscape one piece at a time. Then it stepped into the opening and looked up at the helicopter. The spotlight caught it again, forcing it back toward the trees. But before disappearing beneath the canopy, it stopped beside the entrance to the funnel and looked back one last time. That was the final piece I needed. It wasn't guarding a nest. It wasn't protecting a food source. It had stayed there because whatever it had built was finally finished. Looking down from the helicopter, I realized I hadn't been documenting the albino's behavior. I'd been documenting my own path into the trap it had spent days preparing for me. I did make it home in time for our anniversary, and my wife was right about one thing. I definitely came back with a story. I never accepted another assignment in that part of the forest, and I don't think I ever will. Samuel McKenna was 37 years old, and if you had asked him whether Bigfoot was real, he probably would have smiled and started talking about bears, bad lighting, and wishful thinking. He was a field researcher specializing in large mammal ecology who'd spent years studying wildlife in some of the most remote forests in North America, and he had a reputation for explaining away the unexplained. Sam left for what he expected would be a routine 5-day research expedition. He'd done trips like this plenty of times before, hiking deep into the forest to document wildlife that most people never got to see. The tracks started less than a mile from camp. Sam noticed them while following what he thought was a game trail, and right away they bothered him. Not because they were huge, although they were, but because they didn't look like anything he was used to seeing. They weren't hoof prints or paw prints, and they definitely weren't from a bear. Each one looked almost human. His first instinct wasn't Bigfoot. It was that somebody else had wandered into the area barefoot, which would have been strange enough on its own. But the deeper he looked, the less that made sense. The stride was too long, the impressions were far too deep, and whatever left them had moved through thick brush that would have slowed down just about anything else. Most people would have turned around. Sam followed them, and before long, he realized they weren't the only tracks in those woods anymore. The deeper Sam followed the tracks, the more he felt like he wasn't alone. At first, he brushed it off. Forests are noisy places, trees creak, branches fall, and animals move through the underbrush. After years of working in the field, he knew better than to jump at every sound. But this was different. Every so often, he'd hear a heavy footstep somewhere behind him, and the moment he stopped to listen, it would stop too. A few minutes later, a branch would snap from another direction. He'd turn, wait, and find nothing. It happened often enough that even Sam started paying attention because whatever was out there seemed determined to stay just out of sight. He made it back to camp before sunset, but one thing stayed with him for the rest of the day. That night, he found out he wasn't imagining it. By the time the sun went down, Sam had convinced himself the strange feeling would pass. He cooked dinner, organized the day's photos, and recorded his usual video log. He even joked that if those footprints ended up belonging to the world's most athletic bear, he was never going to hear the end of it from his friends. Sometime after midnight, he woke up to the sound of something moving outside his tent. At first it was slow, almost careful, like heavy footsteps trying not to make any noise. A few moments later, the footsteps came back from a different direction. For the next 20 minutes, whatever was outside circled the campsite without ever coming into view. Every so often, a branch cracked under an incredible amount of weight, then the forest would go silent again. Sam never unzipped the tent, and honestly, I probably wouldn't have either. When morning came, he stepped outside expecting to find tracks from a bear or an elk. Instead, the same enormous footprints from the day before circled the campsite just beyond the trees. Whatever had walked around his camp that night was still out there. The question was, would Sam find it first, or would it find him? The next morning, he didn't waste any time. After taking a few more photos of the footprints around camp, he packed his gear, grabbed the camera, and started following the trail again. Whatever had been outside the tent had left a path that was surprisingly easy to follow, almost like it hadn't cared whether anyone found it. About an hour later, the trail opened into a small clearing. That's where he saw it. Standing between two trees was a massive figure covered in dark brown hair. It was easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms that hung unusually low at its sides. It wasn't crouching or hiding. It was standing completely still, facing in his direction. Instead of running, he did exactly what you'd expect a researcher to do. He raised the camera. The recording lasted only a few seconds before the creature calmly stepped behind a thick pine tree. He kept filming, fully expecting it to come out the other side, but it never did. By the time he reached the tree, the creature was gone. There was nowhere it could have disappeared to that quickly, and the only thing left behind were the same enormous footprints pressed deep into the forest floor. Later that afternoon, while recording his daily video log, he looked into the camera, let out a quiet laugh, and said, "Well, I guess Bigfoot's real." Honestly, I don't think even he realized that was only the beginning. From that point on, the trip wasn't about proving Bigfoot existed anymore. He'd already done that for himself. What he wanted now was to understand what he had just seen. The strange part was how easy it was to find again. Later that afternoon, he spotted it a second time, this time moving slowly along a ridgeline about 200 yards away. It never ran. It never looked startled. If anything, it seemed completely comfortable with the fact that someone was watching. He still thought he was the one observing Bigfoot. He had no idea it was starting to let him get closer. The more footage Sam reviewed, the less Bigfoot made sense. Every large animal he'd ever studied had one thing in common. The moment they realized a person was nearby, they either ran, hid, or became defensive. Bears didn't stand around waiting to be filmed. Wolves certainly didn't. They avoided people whenever they could. Bigfoot did neither of those things. That afternoon, he found it again, feeding along the edge of a clearing. Instead of disappearing when it noticed him, it simply looked up for a few seconds before going back to what it was doing. It wasn't frightened, curious, or defensive. That's what really caught his attention. In one of his notes that evening, he wrote that Bigfoot didn't seem comfortable around people. It seemed familiar with them. There's a big difference between those two things. During his video log that night, he laughed and said, "I've spent years trying to get bears to ignore me. Turns out the only thing that doesn't care that I'm here is Bigfoot." Leave it to Sam to crack a joke after spending the day filming Bigfoot. I don't think he realized he had just described the most unsettling part of the entire story. Bigfoot wasn't acting like an animal that had just discovered a human. It was acting like a human was nothing new. Later that afternoon, Sam decided to try something he'd never normally do. Instead of waiting for Bigfoot to cross his path again, he quietly settled into a spot overlooking the clearing where he'd seen it earlier and waited. Nearly 2 hours passed before movement caught his eye. Bigfoot stepped out from the trees, paused, and looked straight toward the ridge where he was sitting. A few seconds later, it started walking in his direction. Sam stayed where he was with the camera rolling as the distance slowly closed to about 100 yards. Even from there, it was obvious how enormous the creature really was. Then it stopped. It simply stood there, watching him for nearly a minute before turning and disappearing into the trees without the slightest effort to hide itself. That night's recording was noticeably shorter. He still sounded excited, but something had changed. It no longer felt like he was choosing these encounters. The way he saw it, Bigfoot was deciding how close it was willing to let him get. Looking back, I think that's exactly what was happening. The following morning started quietly. Sam headed back toward the same area expecting another glimpse, but the forest felt different. He walked for nearly 3 hours without finding a single fresh track, and for the first time since arriving, it almost felt like Bigfoot had simply disappeared. Then he found one of his trail cameras. The strange part wasn't where it was how it had been left. The camera was sitting upright on a large, flat rock nearly 50 yards from where he'd mounted it the day before. It wasn't damaged. Someone, or something, had carefully removed it from the tree and left it where he was sure to find it. The last few minutes of footage showed Bigfoot walking straight toward the camera. It stopped just a few feet away, stared into the lens for several long seconds, then reached forward with one enormous hand. Recording ended there. In that evening's video log, he couldn't stop thinking about one question. If Bigfoot understood enough to notice the camera, how much else had it noticed about him? When he recovered the camera, Sam expected the mystery to end there. Instead, it raised another question. The memory card had continued recording for a few seconds after Bigfoot picked up the camera. The image swung wildly through the trees before settling on the trail Sam had been using since he arrived. Bigfoot wasn't looking at the camera anymore. It was looking down the path. That thought stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. He followed the trail again, but after a while, the footprints simply disappeared, ending in the middle of the forest with no tracks leading away. He'd spent years tracking wildlife, but he'd never seen an animal that seemed to understand how to avoid being tracked. The next morning, Bigfoot made sure he didn't have to go looking for it. Waiting just beyond the edge of camp was one of the trail markers he'd planted nearly half a mile away. It had been pulled from the ground and carefully leaned against a tree where he couldn't miss it. There were no fresh footprints leading to or from it. Moving the trail marker was unsettling enough. Knowing something had found it in the first place was even worse. What if he wasn't the one tracking Bigfoot anymore? The trail marker stayed on his mind for the rest of the day, but it wasn't enough to scare him away. If anything, it made him even more determined to figure out what was happening. That afternoon, he returned to the same clearing where he'd filmed Bigfoot the day before. It didn't take long before the familiar figure stepped out from the trees. Just like before, he raised the camera and started recording. This time, Bigfoot didn't stand still. It took a few slow steps in his direction before stopping. Then, without any warning, Bigfoot bent down, picked up a rock about the size of a basketball, and threw it. The rock slammed into a tree no more than 15 feet to Sam's right, sending bark flying across the forest floor. With something that large, missing by 15 feet didn't feel accidental. That evening, he couldn't stop replaying the encounter, trying to decide whether Bigfoot had been trying to scare him or warn him. Either way, the message had been received. The rock stayed on his mind the rest of the day, but by the following morning, something else had taken its place. The knocking started just after sunrise. 3 loud knocks echoed through the trees somewhere off to his left. They weren't close enough to make him jump, but they were deliberate enough to make him stop walking. He waited for a few moments, listening, before convincing himself it was probably just a woodpecker. That seemed a lot more reasonable than any of the other possibilities. About a minute later, 3 more knocks echoed through the forest. This time they came from a completely different direction. He stood there for nearly a minute without moving, trying to figure out what he was hearing. There were no voices, no footsteps, no movement through the brush. Just those slow, deliberate knocks spaced a few seconds apart, followed by silence. He recorded the sound before continuing on, but it stayed with him for the rest of the day. Before turning the camera off that evening, he laughed and said that maybe the forest was trying to teach him Morse code. I'll admit, that one got a laugh out of me too. The problem was, the knocking hadn't stopped. It was getting closer. The knocking followed him for most of the morning. Sometimes it echoed from somewhere ahead of him. Other times it came from farther off to his right. Every time he changed direction, the sound seemed to shift with him, but no matter where he looked, he never caught so much as a glimpse of Bigfoot. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up a fallen branch and struck the nearest tree 3 times, then stood there, waiting. For nearly half a minute, nothing happened, and I can only imagine how ridiculous he must have felt standing in the middle of the forest knocking on a tree. Then 3 knocks came back from somewhere deeper in the woods. He didn't answer a second time. Instead, he switched on the camera and started recording, hoping whatever had made the sound would reveal itself. Nothing ever stepped out of the trees. The only thing the microphone picked up was another series of slow, deliberate knocks echoing through the forest before everything went quiet again. He spent the last few minutes of that day's recording talking through every explanation he could think of. Maybe another person was out there. Maybe there was some natural cause he hadn't considered. But after everything he'd seen over the last few days, even he sounded like he was running out of ordinary answers. The next time the knocking started, it wasn't coming from just one direction. The knocking came back the following afternoon while he was hiking along a narrow ridge. At first it sounded just like the day before. 3 slow knocks somewhere off in the distance. He stopped, listened, and waited for another one. It came almost immediately. The second series of knocks echoed from somewhere behind him. He turned around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. Before he could take another step, 3 more knocks rolled through the forest from his left. They weren't loud or frantic. If anything, they sounded deliberate, almost measured, as though something was answering from different parts of the woods. Sam stood there for several minutes, slowly turning in place with the camera rolling. He never caught movement on film, but he did capture the sounds. Listening to the audio later, you can clearly hear the knocks coming from different directions, only seconds apart. He didn't say much before ending the recording that night. The joking had mostly disappeared by then. He simply said he couldn't figure out how one thing could be making those sounds from opposite sides of the forest so quickly. I kept replaying that part of the recording. The more I listened, the less I believed there was only one Bigfoot out there. The rest of the afternoon passed without another sighting, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed. It wasn't any quieter than before. If anything, it was the opposite. Every now and then, he'd catch the sound of a branch bending under something heavy, only for it to stop the moment he looked in that direction. Late in the day, he reached another clearing and decided to stop for a few minutes to swap camera batteries and review some of the footage he'd collected. While he was looking down at the screen, something caught his eye in the corner of the playback. Standing farther back between the trees was another dark figure, almost completely hidden by the shadows. It was only visible for a second or two before the camera shifted away, but when he replayed the clip, it was still there. The strange part was where it had been standing. The first Bigfoot had been in front of him. The second one had been behind it, watching from the tree line without ever stepping into the open. He spent the next several minutes searching the area, but by then, the forest looked completely empty again. Before ending the recording that night, he quietly said something that really stuck with me. "I don't think I've been following just one." And if he was right, that meant he'd been surrounded without even realizing it. He barely covered any ground the next day. Every time he started following a fresh set of tracks, another sound somewhere behind him would make him stop and look back. It felt impossible to focus when he could never tell where anything was anymore. The forest that had seemed so open a few days earlier now felt crowded, even though he still couldn't see anyone. A few minutes later, he caught a dark figure slipping between two trees less than 50 yards away. He took off after it without thinking, camera in one hand and backpack bouncing against his shoulders. By the time he reached the spot where he'd seen it, the figure was gone. All that remained were a fresh set of enormous footprints, and about 30 yards farther ahead, another set was waiting. He followed the new set of footprints for another 20 minutes before something finally clicked. No matter which direction they went, they always seemed to stay just far enough ahead to keep him moving. Every time he thought he was about to catch up, the tracks would veer around another ridge or disappear behind another stand of trees, only to reappear a little farther on. He mentioned something in his notes that really stood out to me. After years of tracking animals, he'd never seen one leave such an easy trail to follow. Most wildlife avoided being found. Whatever he was following almost seemed to be doing the opposite. For the first time, he stopped and seriously considered turning back. Instead, he kept following. He hadn't gone much farther when another movement caught his eye. Bigfoot stepped out from behind a cluster of trees, closer than ever before. There couldn't have been more than 40 feet between them. For several long seconds, they simply stared at each other. Sam slowly lifted the camera and started recording, expecting the creature to slip back into the trees like it always had. Instead, it stayed exactly where it was. You can actually hear his breathing pick up on the recording. After everything he'd seen over the past few days, this was the first time he seemed genuinely unsure of what to do next. Instead of taking another step forward, he slowly began backing away, careful not to turn his back. Bigfoot never came after him. It just stood there, watching until he disappeared into the trees. Looking back, I think that was the first time Sam realized there was a difference between being allowed to get close and being allowed to leave. By the fifth morning, Sam looked exhausted. The excitement that had carried him through the first few days was gone. His voice was quieter, and there were long stretches in the recordings where he simply stared into the trees without saying anything. He mentioned he hadn't slept much the night before. Between the knocking, the footsteps, and the feeling that something was always just outside camp, real sleep had become hard to come by. Even so, he wasn't ready to leave. He packed up his gear, looked over the map one last time, and decided to follow the same trail where he'd had the closest encounter the day before. He said if he could just get one clear explanation for everything that had happened, the trip would be worth it. I think that's the moment he stopped thinking like a researcher. He was chasing answers, and whatever was waiting deeper in that forest seemed more than willing to give him one. He found the trail almost immediately, but this time something felt different. The footprints were easy to follow, almost too easy. Every few hundred yards, another fresh print appeared in the soft ground, just enough to keep him moving without ever letting him catch up. After another 10 minutes, he realized the forest had gone completely silent. There weren't any birds calling overhead or squirrels darting through the brush. Even the constant background noise he'd gotten used to over the past few days had disappeared. After years of working outdoors, Sam knew silence like that usually meant every other animal had already decided it was safer to leave. A branch cracked somewhere ahead. He raised the camera and slowly started walking toward the sound. Before he'd taken more than a few steps, another branch snapped behind him. He turned immediately, expecting to catch something moving between the trees, but there was nothing there except rows of pines stretching in every direction. He kept recording as he moved forward, stopping every few yards to listen. Nothing else made a sound. It wasn't until later, while reviewing the footage at camp, that he noticed a dark figure slipping through the trees off to his right. It only appeared for a second before disappearing again. But one thing became painfully obvious. It hadn't been in front of him. It had been walking alongside him the entire time. That discovery stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. Instead of heading back to camp, he sat down with the map, his notes, and the GPS recordings from the past few days, trying to make sense of where all these encounters had happened. At first, nothing stood out. Then he started drawing lines between each location. The first sighting, the ridgeline, the clearing, the trail camera, the place where the rock had landed. None of them were random. They formed a slow, winding path that led deeper into the forest. He spent the next few minutes staring at the map without saying a word. When he finally spoke, he wondered out loud if he'd been asking the wrong question the entire time. Instead of trying to figure out where Bigfoot was going, maybe he should have been asking where Bigfoot was taking him. He folded the map, packed it away, and kept walking. The next set of footprints was already waiting for him. The footprints led him into a narrow valley he'd never planned on visiting. It wasn't marked on any of his original routes, and judging by how overgrown the trail had become, very few people had walked through it in a long time. The first thing he noticed was the size of the trees. They were older, taller, and packed so tightly together that very little sunlight reached the ground. Even in the middle of the afternoon, the whole valley felt strangely dim. Then he started seeing footprints. Some looked fresh, while others had already begun filling with leaves and pine needles. They crossed over one another in every direction, making it almost impossible to tell which way any one of them had gone. He slowly turned the camera, trying to capture as much of the ground as possible. For the first time since arriving, Sam stopped following the tracks. He'd finally reached the place where they all seemed to lead. He hadn't been in the valley long before movement caught his eye. A dark figure stepped out from behind a massive cedar no more than 30 yards away. Instead of disappearing, it stood there watching while he slowly raised the camera. A few seconds later, another figure moved between the trees farther up the valley, then another. He slowly turned in a circle, but no matter where he pointed the camera, there always seemed to be another shape standing just beyond the tree line. He wasn't looking at a lone Bigfoot anymore. He'd walked into their territory. That was enough. After spending nearly an hour in the valley, Sam made his way back toward camp without stopping to film anything else. The excitement that had brought him into the forest was gone. Whatever answers he'd been looking for, he felt like he'd already found more than he was prepared for. Back at camp, he started packing his gear and mentioned that leaving in the morning was probably the smartest decision he'd made all week. He even laughed that his dogs were going to get a very long walk when he got home because he'd had enough of sleeping in the woods. Then he opened the camera one last time to review the footage from the valley. That's when he noticed one of the figures hadn't been watching from a distance. It had been following him back toward camp. Sam headed back without stopping again, and for the first time since the trip began, he wasn't thinking about finding Bigfoot. He was thinking about getting home. He spent the evening packing most of his gear and making sure everything was ready for an early start the next morning. He even mentioned that 5 days in the woods had been more than enough, and that a hot meal and a real bed were sounding better by the hour. Before calling it a night, he sat down to review the footage from the valley one last time. Every encounter over the past 5 days had happened deeper in the forest than the one before it. Without realizing it, he'd spent the entire expedition walking exactly where Bigfoot wanted him to go. The next morning, Sam broke camp just after sunrise and started hiking toward the trailhead. For the first hour, everything felt almost normal. There weren't any strange sounds, no movement between the trees, and no fresh footprints waiting for him around the next bend. After everything that had happened over the past 5 days, the silence almost felt reassuring. Then he spotted another footprint. It was fresh. A few minutes later, there was another. The tracks weren't leading away from him anymore. They were heading in the same direction he was, appearing every so often along the trail as though something had passed through only moments earlier. He slowed down, scanning the woods on either side of the path, but never saw what had made them. It looked like he wasn't the only one leaving the valley. Sam never made it out that morning. About an hour after leaving camp, the camera captured its closest footage yet. One Bigfoot stepped out from behind a line of trees less than 20 feet away and stood perfectly still, staring at him. And then another Bigfoot emerged farther down the trail. Then another appeared behind him. He slowly turned in a circle, but every direction was the same. One stood ahead of him, another off to his left, another behind him. They weren't surrounding him by accident. They were blocking every way out. The next few minutes were some of the hardest parts of the footage to watch. The camera shook as Sam slowly backed away, never taking his eyes off the tree line. The Bigfoot didn't chase him, but they didn't leave either. Every time he tried to back away, another dark figure would quietly appear farther ahead, forcing him to stop again. He stopped talking completely. The occasional heavy breath was the only reminder that the camera was still recording. Then, without warning, he turned and started running. The footage became almost impossible to follow after that. The camera bounced wildly as Sam pushed through the trees, and every few seconds, another loud crack echoed somewhere behind him. More than once he glanced over his shoulder, but whatever was chasing him never stayed in frame long enough to make out clearly. Then the camera suddenly stopped moving. For a few seconds, all it captured was the forest. A heavy set of footsteps came from somewhere just outside the frame. The camera tilted sharply toward the ground, and that was the last thing it ever recorded. Search teams reached Sam's campsite later that week after he failed to return. His tent was still standing, most of his equipment was exactly where he'd left it, and there was no sign that he'd ever made it back. The only reason anyone knows what happened over those 5 days is because of the backup drive they recovered with his recordings, field notes, and camera footage. The files end exactly where you just saw them. After that, there isn't another recording, another note, or any clue that explains what happened to Samuel McKenna. But one thing is certain, Samuel McKenna spent 5 days filming what he believed was Bigfoot. Then he vanished without a trace. I just felt it, a weight settling on the back of my neck like something enormous had leaned in close to look at me. And that was before I ever saw the shape at the tree line that made my stomach drop into my shoes. It was tall, impossibly tall, easily 9 feet, standing between 2 oaks with its arms hanging loose at its sides, covered head to foot in matted black hair. I blinked and it was gone, folded back into the shadows like it had never been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. I had just moved my family into the woods with Bigfoot. I didn't say anything to my wife when I went back inside. She was already stressed enough, unpacking boxes with our 6-year-old daughter tugging at her sleeve, and our 10-year-old son sulking on the stairs because there was no internet. Our Labrador, Max, wouldn't stop pacing by the back door, whining low in his throat, and I chalked it up to a new house and unfamiliar smells. I didn't chalk up the thing at the tree line to anything. I just found the crowbar in one of the toolboxes and set it by the front door where I could grab it fast, and I didn't tell my wife why. Bigfoot was out there. I didn't have the words yet to say it out loud, not even to myself, so I just carried the crowbar around the house like it was normal, like everybody unpacks a fixer-upper with a steel bar in one hand, and I kept glancing at the windows every few minutes, watching for that black shape to come back out of the tree line. We ate dinner by lantern light because half the outlets in the house weren't wired to the generator circuit yet, just frozen pizza, microwaved on the one line that worked, eaten off paper plates at a card table because our real furniture was still in boxes. Max wouldn't touch his food. He sat by the back window with his ears pinned flat and his lips curling back off his teeth, growling at something none of the rest of us could see. I told the kids it was probably a raccoon. I didn't believe it for a second. I kept thinking about the shape between the oaks, the way it hadn't moved like an animal, hadn't moved like anything should move, just stood there watching us unload our whole lives into a house it apparently considered its own. Bigfoot. The word kept surfacing in my head, no matter how hard I tried to push it down, as something ridiculous, something from late-night cable specials, not something that belonged in my new kitchen with my kids eating pizza 6 feet away. Then I saw the handprint on the glass. Right there on the outside of the window, Max was growling at, a huge smeared print with 5 fingers splayed wide and claw marks gouged into the fog of condensation, a print the size of a dinner plate. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed the flashlight off the counter and went out the back door before my wife could ask where I was going, and the second I stepped onto the porch, the night air felt wrong, thick and still, like the whole property was holding its breath. The grass around the house was flattened in a wide, deliberate circle, like something had walked the entire perimeter of our home, checking every window, every door, cataloging every way in. I followed the flattened path with my flashlight shaking in my hand, and I found the tracks near the tree line, each one nearly 18 inches long, 5 toes pressed deep into the dirt, a stride length longer than anything on 2 legs had any business making. Bigfoot had walked a full lap around my house while my family ate pizza inside. I followed the tracks to the edge of the trees, and they simply stopped, not faded, not trailed off into leaf litter the way a normal animal's prints would. They stopped dead, mid-stride, like whatever made them had lifted straight up off the ground and vanished. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the last print, and the edges of it were still crumbling inward, fresh, wet, no more than a minute or 2 old, which meant Bigfoot had been standing exactly where I now knelt only moments before I got there. I stood there with the flashlight beam trembling across bare dirt, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I had never in my life felt so certain that I was being watched by something that could kill me in about 4 seconds if it wanted to. Somewhere off to my right, a branch snapped, a single dry crack in the total silence, and I swung the flashlight toward it and caught nothing but empty trunk and black spaces between them, any one of which could have been hiding 9 feet of muscle and matted hair. I backed away without turning around because some old animal part of my brain told me not to show my back to the tree line, and I didn't stop backing up until I hit the porch steps, my boots catching twice on the uneven ground because I couldn't make myself look down. Bigfoot was out there in the dark, close enough to smell my sweat, and I had brought my wife and my kids to live 20 yards from it. Inside, I barricaded the front door with the entryway bench and told my wife we were leaving first thing in the morning. She didn't ask why. She just looked at my face, at whatever was written across it, and she nodded and started quietly moving the kids' shoes by the door so we wouldn't waste time in the morning hunting for them. I loaded the hunting rifle I kept in the hall closet, an old bolt action I'd used exactly twice for deer, and I sat by the front window with the barrel resting on my knee, watching the black wall of trees for any hint of movement. The generator kept humming its steady mechanical drone from the basement, the only sound in a night that had otherwise gone dead silent. And somewhere out there, Bigfoot was moving through the dark, learning the shape of my house, learning where my family slept. I saw the eyes first, 2 dull amber circles reflecting back at me from about 50 yards out, low to the ground, and then suddenly not low at all, rising up and up until I understood with a sick lurch that they belonged to something standing 9.5 feet tall. For one long frozen second, neither of us moved, and in that second I could hear my own heartbeat pounding against my cracked eardrums louder than anything else in the world. Then Bigfoot came out of the tree line at a speed that should not have been possible for something that size, covering 50 yards in what felt like 2 seconds flat, its huge feet tearing up clumps of grass and dirt with every stride, and it hit our parked car broadside with its shoulder and flipped it onto its roof in an explosion of shattering glass and screaming metal that echoed off the tree line like a gunshot. Max bolted for the porch, barking hysterically, claws scrabbling on the gravel, and Bigfoot pivoted with terrifying grace and drove one massive fist straight through the siding of the house to snag the dog by the leg as he ran past, wrenching him sideways and flinging him across the yard like a toy. Max hit the ground in a yelping heap and dragged himself toward the tree line, whimpering, one leg clearly broken, and the sound of that whimper cutting through the chaos did something to me that the roar of an engine flipping never could. I was already moving before I decided to move, screaming for everyone to get inside as I ripped the front door open and charged out into the yard with the crowbar raised over my head. Bigfoot turned toward me, and up close it was a nightmare of scar tissue and matted black fur, its chest crossed with old wounds that had healed into thick ridges, and I swung the crowbar into its knee with everything I had. It felt like hitting a telephone pole. Bigfoot didn't even flinch from the pain, just made a low, irritated grunt and backhanded me across the yard with a blow that lifted me clean off my feet. I slammed into an old tree stump and felt 2 of my ribs give way with a crunch I felt more than heard, white-hot pain flooding my whole side as I struggled to breathe. Through the haze, I saw my wife burst out onto the porch, and Bigfoot lunged at her with one clawed hand, and she threw her arm up to block it out of pure instinct. The claws opened her forearm from wrist to elbow, 4 deep parallel gashes, pumping blood down onto the porch boards, and she screamed and collapsed against the railing. Something in me overrode the pain in my chest, and I forced myself up, staggered to the overturned car, and wrenched the hunting rifle free from where it had fallen against the crushed doorframe. I fired 3 rounds into Bigfoot's chest as fast as I could work the bolt, and each shot punched it backward a half step, black blood spraying from the wounds, and finally it let out a bone-shaking roar of pain and fury and retreated in 3 enormous bounds back into the tree line, gone as fast as it had come. I dragged my wife inside by her good arm, while the kids screamed and clung to each other in the hallway, and I shoved the couch against the splintered front door with my cracked ribs, screaming in protest. Bigfoot was still out there. I could feel it. The generator kept humming below our feet like nothing in the world was wrong, and I understood with total clarity that whatever was happening to us tonight had only just begun. The bombardment started without warning, a boulder the size of a basketball crashing through the kitchen roof and caving in half the ceiling in an avalanche of plaster dust and splintered beams. Bigfoot wasn't charging the house anymore. It was standing somewhere out in the dark, hurling rocks with the force of a wrecking ball, and a second stone blew straight through the living room window, showering my daughter in glass as she screamed and dove behind the couch. I herded everyone toward the basement stairs, the sturdiest part of the house, while a third impact collapsed the entire front porch under a half-ton slab of stone that must have come from somewhere deep in the woods. Bigfoot was methodical about it. I realized as I watched the pattern of impacts that it wasn't hurling randomly. It was targeting the corners of the house, the load-bearing points, trying to bring the whole structure down on top of us. I sent my wife down to the basement with the kids, her arm wrapped tight in a dish towel that was already soaked through, and I stayed upstairs with the rifle, firing at muzzle flash glimpses of movement out at the tree line every time a shape shifted in the dark. Every impact sent a shudder through the floorboards under my feet, dust sifting down from the ceiling in fine gray sheets, and twice a stone landed so close to the window I was crouched behind that the glass fractured into a spiderweb without even breaking through. Bigfoot didn't retreat from the gunfire this time, just kept throwing. Boulder after boulder, some of them tearing clean through drywall and lodging in the far walls, the house groaning and shuddering around me like a ship taking broadside hits in open water. I clipped it once in the shoulder, and it let out a furious bellow that rattled the remaining window panes, but it didn't stop, and I found myself counting my remaining shells with a dry mouth, down to 5, then rationing every shot like my family's life depended on each one, because it did. The rocks stopped falling right around 10:30, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise, because I knew Bigfoot wasn't finished. I knew this was only the pause between rounds of something far longer and far worse than I had let myself imagine. The generator kept humming from below, oblivious, indifferent, the one steady sound left in a house that had otherwise gone silent and broken. I stood at the shattered window with 5 shells left and waited for whatever Bigfoot was going to try next. It came for the front door at a dead run, and this time it didn't claw or grab. It simply lowered its shoulder and slammed into the wood like a freight train, the first impact splitting the frame with a crack that shook the whole entryway. I threw my body against the couch we'd wedged there, bracing with my good side while my ribs screamed, and I shouted for the kids to bring anything heavy they could drag, the bookshelf, the china cabinet, whatever wasn't nailed down. Bigfoot hit the door a second time, and the couch skidded backward 6 inches across the floor despite my full weight against it, and I understood in that moment that brute strength alone was going to get it through eventually, no matter what we piled against the frame. The third impact split the door down the center, and Bigfoot didn't wait for the fourth. It punched straight through the drywall beside the frame instead, exploding through studs and insulation in a spray of debris, one massive clawed hand raking across my forearm as I scrambled back. I grabbed a screwdriver off the floor from a spilled toolbox and drove it into the back of that reaching hand as hard as I could, and Bigfoot recoiled with a furious howl, yanking the wounded hand back through the hole it had made. I barely had a second to breathe before it hit the door again, harder this time, and the whole thing gave way at once. A huge, hairy arm shot through the gap and closed around my son's ankle before any of us could react, the claws piercing straight through his sock and into skin, and he screamed as Bigfoot started dragging him toward the opening, his fingers scrabbling uselessly against the hardwood floor for something to hold on to. I lunged and grabbed his other leg, hauling backward with everything my broken ribs had left in them, my vision going white at the edges from the pain, and my wife, blood soaking through the towel on her arm, snatched a cast-iron skillet off the floor and brought it down on Bigfoot's wrist with a clang that rang through the whole hallway like a church bell. The grip loosened just enough, tendons and claws slipping half an inch across bloody skin, and I wrenched my son free and fell backward with him into the hallway, both of us gasping, his small body trembling violently against mine as the arm withdrew back through the splintered gap. The door held, barely, wedged shut again with a length of steel pipe I jammed between the frame and the floorboards, and I looked down at my son's ankle to find deep parallel claw marks welling dark blood, his face already going pale and glassy with shock. I slapped his cheek lightly and told him to stay with me, that we weren't done yet, and outside I could hear Bigfoot pacing, snorting, working itself up for whatever came next. I had 4 shells left, The scraping started above us less than 15 minutes later, heavy claws dragging across shingles, and I watched in horror as the living room ceiling began to bow downward under some tremendous weight. Bigfoot was on the roof, tearing it apart piece by piece, and a moment later, a clawed hand punched clean through the plaster and ripped the ceiling fan out by its wiring in a shower of sparks and dust. Another claw came through beside it, then another, widening the hole with terrifying speed, and I realized with a jolt of pure animal fear that it wasn't trying to collapse the house anymore. It was trying to climb down inside it. I grabbed the shotgun from the hall closet and forced myself up through the attic hatch despite the grinding pain in my ribs, crawling through pitch-black insulation toward the sound of Bigfoot's breathing directly above the plywood decking, close enough that I could smell it, a thick, wet animal stench that made my eyes water. The shingles above my head bowed and cracked with every shift of its weight, and dust and splinters rained down into my hair as I raised the shotgun blind and fired straight up through the roof. I was rewarded with a furious roar and a heavy thud as it lost its footing and crashed off the edge onto the lawn below, the whole house rocking on its foundation from the impact. I fired a second shot after it through the new hole and heard it bellow again as it retreated a short distance across the yard, but I knew it wasn't gone for good, and I was right, because seconds later, a new tear opened directly above the attic hatch, shingles and beams splitting apart like matchsticks, and a massive dark shape dropped straight down through the ceiling into the living room below with a crash that shook dust out of every corner of the house. I slid down out of the attic as fast as my body would let me, shotgun raised, my family huddled somewhere behind the basement door I prayed was still holding against whatever was happening up here. Bigfoot was hunched in the middle of the wrecked living room, sniffing the air, its shoulders nearly brushing the exposed ceiling joists on either side, and when it turned its head toward me, its eyes caught the lantern light and glowed for a half second, like two dying embers, and I felt every hair on my body stand up at once. I fired without thinking, the blast catching it high in the shoulder and spinning it half around in a spray of dark blood, and it swiped back at me with one raking claw that opened a gash across my forehead, blood immediately pouring into my eye and turning half the room red. I ducked low, worked the pump with only 2 shells left, my hands slick with my own blood, and fired again, point blank into its chest as it lunged for me a second time. Bigfoot staggered backward into the fireplace, cracked mantel stones raining down around it in a cloud of soot and dust, and went still, twitching faintly in the debris, one massive hand still curling and uncurling against the hearth. I didn't stop to see if it was really dead. I couldn't afford to. I dragged the massive body outside, by its arm, my whole body screaming with every step, and left it in the yard while I hunted through the wreckage for anything to cover the gaping hole in the roof. I found a sheet of plywood in the garage and nailed it over the worst of the opening, though I knew even as I hammered the last nail that it wouldn't hold against anything determined to get through it. The generator kept humming steadily below the chaos, the only normal sound left in a house that had been torn nearly in half, and I had 2 shells left in a shotgun I wasn't sure would matter if Bigfoot came again. The next attack didn't come as an attack at all. It came as my daughter's voice screaming from somewhere out in the backyard, calling for me, telling me it had her, and my blood turned to ice as I spun toward the back door. Then I saw her standing right beside me in the hallway, crying, very much inside the house, and I understood with a fresh wave of horror that Bigfoot was throwing her own voice back at us with perfect, sickening accuracy. Moments later, my son's voice cried out from the front yard, begging for help, though he was slumped against the basement doorframe not 6 feet from me. And I realized Bigfoot wasn't just an animal. It was hunting our minds now as much as our bodies. And unable to reconcile what she was hearing, started crawling toward the front door where the fake cries kept coming, her small hands pushing against the floorboards, and I grabbed her and held her against my chest while the voice kept calling out that it hurt, that it needed help, in tones so exact I nearly believed it myself, despite the fact that I could feel her tiny heartbeat racing against my own ribs at that exact moment. The voice moved too, drifting from the front yard to somewhere near the side of the house, then back again, as if Bigfoot were pacing a slow circle around us while it worked its trick, testing which direction would pull us out fastest. Then the voice shifted again, calling my wife's name in a pitch-perfect imitation of our daughter's cries, and my wife, dizzy and pale from blood loss, began dragging herself up the basement stairs, insisting that our girl was really out there, one hand smearing blood along the stair rail as she pulled herself upward. I had to physically block her, holding her back while she fought me with more strength than her ruined arm should have had left in it. sobbing that she could hear our daughter, that we had to go now, and I finally forced her back down the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, my own eyes blurring with tears because even I couldn't be sure anymore what was real and what Bigfoot had manufactured to tear us apart from the inside. Somewhere above us, the voice let out one last broken sob, and then it stopped, and the silence that followed felt worse than any of it, because silence from Bigfoot never meant safety. It only ever meant the next thing was already coming. The mimicry stopped as suddenly as it started, and in the silence that followed, Bigfoot came through the kitchen window in near total silence, glass exploding inward in a glittering spray as it seized my daughter by the hair before I could even shout a warning, yanking her clean off her feet. I threw myself at it without a single thought in my head, driving my shoulder into its midsection and slamming it back into the counter hard enough to crack the tile backsplash, and its claws raked down my back in 4 burning lines that felt like being branded with a hot iron. I grabbed a kitchen knife off the counter, the same knife we'd used to cut the frozen pizza only hours earlier, and drove it into the side of its throat with a scream tearing out of my own chest, twisting the blade as it sank in. Thick, dark blood sheeted down over my hand and forearm, hot and reeking, and Bigfoot released my daughter and dropped convulsing to the kitchen floor, one fist beating weakly against the linoleum before going still. My daughter was pale, bleeding from a dozen shallow glass cuts across her back, and I gathered her up and carried her down to the basement where the rest of my family lay in various states of ruin, my wife barely conscious, my son's ankles swollen and hot to the touch, infection already setting in. I was the only one still standing, and I didn't feel like I was standing on much. The generator hummed on below us, oblivious to everything, and I had exactly 1 shell left in the shotgun and no idea if it would be enough for whatever Bigfoot had left in it. The scraping came from beneath the basement floor sometime after 3 in the morning, a slow, deliberate clawing sound working its way toward us through packed earth, and I understood with total dread that Bigfoot was tunneling directly toward the one thing keeping any part of our lives functioning, the generator itself. I grabbed the fireman's axe from the utility shelf and the one working flashlight, and went to stand over the machine as the dirt in the corner of the basement began to heave and crack, a massive clawed hand finally breaking through into open air. I swung the axe down across those fingers as hard as my exhausted arms could manage, and Bigfoot howled and yanked back, only to start digging again with even more ferocity, dirt and roots flying in every direction, tearing the hole wider until it was big enough to fit a body through. The flashlight beam jittered wildly across the widening pit as my hand shook, and I could hear the wet, ragged sound of Bigfoot's breathing echoing up out of the tunnel. Labored now, wounded, but not slowing. I planted myself directly in front of the generator, axe raised over my head, defending the one dumb humming machine that had somehow become the whole battlefield of this night, while Bigfoot's head finally emerged from the hole, bloodied, one eye swollen completely shut, matted fur clumped with dried and fresh blood alike, its chest a ruin of shotgun wounds oozing dark fluid with every breath, and still it kept coming, dragging itself up out of the earth toward me with a hatred that didn't look like it was ever going to run out, no matter how many times I hit it. I brought the axe down across its skull with everything I had left in my body, and Bigfoot went rigid, then limp, and I thought for one heartbeat that it was finally over, until its other hand shot out and clamped around my ankle and yanked me off my feet. I hit the concrete face first, pain exploding across my nose, and by the time I rolled over, Bigfoot had hauled itself the rest of the way up out of the tunnel and was standing over me, swaying, dark blood dripping steadily from a dozen wounds onto the basement floor. I crawled toward the generator on my hands and knees, blood from my forehead dripping steadily onto the concrete beneath me, and I actually begged out loud for it to leave the machine alone, for my family's sake, because without it we had nothing left. No lights, no water, no way to keep my kids alive through what remained of the night. Bigfoot looked down at me without a trace of mercy in its one open eye, breathing in slow, ragged pulls through a throat still leaking blood from earlier wounds, and then it turned its ruined body toward the generator and drove one heavy foot into its side, not even hard, almost casual, the way a man might nudge something off a table without a second thought, just enough to tip the whole unit onto the concrete. The engine sputtered, sparks hissed and died, and the hum that had followed us since we arrived at this house cut out completely, plunging the basement into total, suffocating darkness, broken only by the sound of Bigfoot's slow, ragged breathing somewhere above me in the dark. I sat in that blackness, holding the cold, dead shell of the generator, while my wife lay unconscious a few feet away, my daughter slipping deeper into fever. my son's ankles swollen tight and hot with infection, and I understood with the last shotgun shell trembling in my pocket that Bigfoot had never wanted our blood at all. It wanted the silence back, the silence the forest had known for centuries before we ever rolled a U-Haul up that gravel driveway with a machine that never stopped humming. I never saw Bigfoot again after that night, though I sometimes still hear that engine drone in my dreams, cutting out into nothing, and I think about the way it looked at me right before it left, not like a monster satisfied with a kill, but like something ancient finally getting its silence back. My name is Chad, and my SD card was still warm from the trail camera housing when I slid it into my laptop. I always do this the same way, sitting on the tailgate, boots still muddy from the 4-mile hike out to the ridge, cold coffee sweating in the cup holder. The timestamp reads 4:47 in the morning. The infrared kicks the footage into that flat gray wash, and at first I think it is an elk standing wrong, some trick of shadow against the pine trunks. Then it moves, and the shoulders roll in a way no elk shoulder has ever rolled, and I sit up so fast I nearly knock the laptop off my knee. Bigfoot was standing 8 yards from the lens, broad as a doorway, dark fur matted across a chest marked with old scars that catch the infrared like pale seams. This Bigfoot is enormous. I would guess 9 feet if it straightened all the way up, which it is not doing because it is watching something just outside the left edge of the frame. I hold my breath. A second shape steps into view. This second Bigfoot is smaller, maybe 7 feet, and the difference between the two of them is not just height. The fur is patchy along the shoulders, thinner, the color a shade lighter, almost rust in places. Every movement this smaller Bigfoot makes is careful, coiled, the kind of body language I have seen in young animals that already know something about the world can hurt them. Both of them are carrying meat. I pause the footage right there and just stare at the screen for a solid minute because that detail alone breaks something in my head. Bigfoot, carrying a fresh haunch of what I will later confirm from the drag marks, was a white-tailed deer. 2 of them, independently sourced kills apparently, because the cuts do not match. I press play again, and my stomach drops even sooner this time, because now I know what is coming, and somehow that makes it worse instead of better. The massive Bigfoot starts closing the distance on the smaller one with slow, deliberate strides that never hesitate, and every instinct I have built from years of watching wildlife footage screams that this is about to become a robbery. Bigger animal wants what smaller animal has. That is the whole grammar of the wild, the one rule that almost never breaks. Dominance, intimidation, theft. The massive Bigfoot's shoulders drop low, its head extends forward, and its arms swing less with each step until its entire posture looks heavy with intent. I have only ever associated that body language with intimidation, with an animal preparing to force another one to surrender something valuable. I actually say something out loud to my empty truck, some version of "here we go, brace for it," because I think I am about to watch Bigfoot bully Bigfoot out of a meal. Even before they touch, I have already written the ending in my head, because every predator I have ever studied follows the same script. That is not what happens. The smaller Bigfoot does not flinch, does not tighten its grip on the meat, does not lower itself into a defensive stance, and does not run. It stands there almost impossibly calm, as though the larger Bigfoot approaching is not a threat at all. Then, instead of focusing on the meat, it turns half sideways toward a low shrub at the edge of the frame, some kind of berry bramble with deep red clusters that remain visible even through the grainy infrared image. The movement is slow, controlled, almost casual. With its free hand, the smaller Bigfoot strips a fistful of berries from the branch without taking its eyes completely off the larger Bigfoot. Then it extends its arm forward, palm up, holding the berries out in the exact universal gesture of an offering. I have watched this sequence 6 times now, pausing it frame by frame until the video turns into a slideshow, and it simply does not read as anything else. Not surrender, not distraction, not fear. Bigfoot offering food to another Bigfoot. The massive Bigfoot stops mid-stride, just stops, no more than 10 feet from full contact, and lowers its gaze to that open palm. For several long seconds, neither Bigfoot moves at all, and the entire encounter becomes something I cannot fit into any explanation I brought with me. What happens next is the moment that changes everything I thought this was going to be. Even after all these replays, it is still the part that catches me off guard. The massive Bigfoot reaches out, takes the berries from the smaller Bigfoot's open hand, and pauses. There is no rush, no possessive grab, no no attempt to seize the meat at the same time. It simply brings the berries to its mouth and eats them, slow and unhurried, chewing with its head tilted ever so slightly, like it is actually considering the flavor. The smaller Bigfoot never backs away during any of this. It just waits. Then the massive Bigfoot looks down at the haunch it has been carrying, shifts its grip, plants both enormous hands on either side of the meat, and tears it cleanly in half with a single motion that looks almost effortless for something that size. There is no struggle, no dramatic display of strength, just one smooth pull, and suddenly there are two equal portions. The massive Bigfoot extends one half forward. The smaller Bigfoot accepts it without hesitation. No snatching, no signs of fear, no aggression from either side, just an exchange that is as calm and orderly as a handshake at a farmer's market. For another second, they simply stand there facing one another before the smaller Bigfoot turns, cradles its new half-share, and walks quietly into the tree line. The massive Bigfoot watches it disappear between the trunks, then turns the opposite direction and vanishes into the forest as well, the last thing visible in the infrared image being the berries still clutched in its other fist. I want to be careful here because I know exactly how this sounds, and I know the temptation is to dismiss it the moment someone describes it out loud instead of showing the footage. But watch the sequence yourself and tell me this is not a trade. Tell me this is simply dominance or scavenging or coincidence, because I cannot make those explanations fit what is actually on the screen. The smaller Bigfoot voluntarily offers something before any force is used. The massive Bigfoot accepts that offering instead of taking the meat. Only after receiving the berries does the massive Bigfoot divide its own food and hand over an equal share. Both Bigfoot leave carrying something they did not arrive with, and neither one attempts to follow, threaten, or challenge the other afterward. If you showed me the same interaction between two people dressed in heavy winter clothing, nobody would hesitate to call it a barter. Yet, because these are Bigfoot, we instinctively reach for simpler explanations, even when they stop matching the evidence in front of us. On this ridge, in the cold gray hour before dawn, Bigfoot appeared to recognize that berries had value, offer them in exchange for meat, receive an equitable portion in return, and walk away with the exchange complete. That is not the kind of animal behavior we have been taught to expect. Whether there is another explanation or not, what the footage appears to show is something that looks remarkably like economics. It looks like Bigfoot operating a barter system in the middle of a national forest while the rest of us are asleep. I ran the numbers on this exchange more than once because I wanted to be sure I was not projecting a story onto something that could be explained away as coincidence. The berries the younger Bigfoot offered were not just any berries pulled at random. They came from a specific bramble that, based on the other cards I pulled off this same ridge over the following 2 weeks, only fruits along a narrow band of elevation about 400 feet higher than where the deer typically bed down. That means the younger Bigfoot had to know, ahead of time, exactly where to find something the massive Bigfoot would want, and had to be carrying it, or know where to retrieve it quickly, at the precise moment it needed leverage. That is not luck, that is planning. Bigfoot, stocking a form of currency before it was ever needed, the same way a person might keep cash folded in a jacket pocket, just in case. The more I sat with that detail, the less this whole exchange looked like an accident of two animals crossing paths, and the more it looked like a transaction two parties had run before, comfortable enough with the terms that neither one hesitated. This new footage might uncover a lot about Bigfoot, but if you truly want to hear everything I've discovered, you can find it at the link in the description. Not everything can be shared on this platform. It's simply too sensitive. If two Bigfoots trading meat for berries at 4 in the morning is enough to rattle you, buckle in, because the very next clip on this card introduces a third figure to this ridge. And the moment it arrives, the massive Bigfoot that just dominated every frame suddenly looks like the smallest, most nervous thing in the whole forest. I almost skipped past the next clip because the timestamp is only 6 minutes later, and I assume it is more of the same pair circling back through frame. I am wrong, and I am wrong in a way that makes the hair stand up on my arms even now, months later, describing it to you. A third shape enters from the right side of the screen, and everything about how it moves is different from the first two, where the massive Bigfoot moved with weight and purpose, and the younger Bigfoot moved with nervous energy. This new arrival moves slow, stooped, deliberate in a way that reads unmistakably as old. The fur around its face is pale, almost silver against the infrared, a stark collar of gray running from the temples down along the jaw. Its shoulders carry a permanent forward curve, the posture of something that has spent decades bearing weight, decades walking these ridgelines, long before any trail camera was bolted to a pine trunk. I am going to call this one the Elder, because there is no other word that fits what I am watching. Bigfoot but ancient, Bigfoot but venerable. The kind of presence that makes you understand, on a gut level, that you are looking at rank before you understand the social structure that produces it. The younger Bigfoot, the same one that traded away half its meat share only minutes earlier, reappears almost immediately, and the change in its body language is so abrupt it is impossible to miss. The second it notices the elder Bigfoot standing farther up the ridge, every trace of its calm disappears. It practically launches itself across the frame, covering the distance in quick bounding strides, its arms moving almost as much as its legs. Then it starts making sounds unlike anything in my library of recorded vocalizations. It is not the deep roar people expect or the long, mournful calls sometimes reported by witnesses. This is a rapid clattering, almost like someone drumming knuckles against hollow wood, except wetter somehow, more organic, broken up by short, sharp grunts that come so quickly they almost overlap each other. The entire outburst has an unmistakable urgency to it, as though the younger Bigfoot cannot get the information out fast enough. It keeps pointing with one arm back toward the direction the massive Bigfoot disappeared, stabbing the air over and over while shifting its weight from foot to foot. Every few seconds it looks toward the trees, then back at the elder Bigfoot, repeating the same gestures with growing intensity. I do not think I am reaching when I say the whole interaction looks exactly like a child running to a grandparent to report something that just happened with an older sibling. Bigfoot tattling. Bigfoot seeking justice from an authority it clearly knows, recognizes, and trusts. The elder does not rush. That is the detail that gets me every time I rewatch this clip. There is no urgency in the response, no barking correction, no display of force to match the report. The elder simply turns and begins walking, slow and rolling, toward wherever the massive Bigfoot has gone, and the younger one falls in step half a pace behind, practically vibrating with anticipation. I switch to the next camera in the sequence, camera 4, staked about 60 yards further down the drainage. And there it is, the massive Bigfoot, still working through the last of its berries, utterly unaware that judgment is walking its way through the timber. The elder approaches without a single aggressive cue. No bared teeth, no chest display, no vocalization at all. It simply walks directly up to the massive Bigfoot, 9 feet of scarred muscle that dominated every frame it appeared in 20 minutes earlier, and places one hand flat against its chest. That's it. One hand resting there, still as a held breath, and the massive Bigfoot, the same creature that closed distance on a smaller rival, with its shoulders dropped and its head lowered like a linebacker, goes instantly, completely still. No resistance, no posturing, no attempt to shrug the hand away. Bigfoot, the biggest and strongest thing I have ever put on camera, simply yields. I need you to sit with how strange that is, because I have. There is no fight here, no scuffle, no show of dominance requiring a show of submission in return. What I am looking at is not a pecking order built on size and violence, the kind of hierarchy you see in every nature documentary about wolves or primates. This is something else entirely, a structure where physical power defers, immediately and without hesitation, to something else: authority, wisdom, and seniority. Whatever word you want to use, the massive Bigfoot has it beaten into its bones that the elder outranks it, and it does not require force to enforce that ranking. Bigfoot has a chain of command, and I am watching it function in real time on a Forest Service ridge at 5 in the morning. That single hand on that scarred chest should have been the strangest thing I saw all week. It was not even close, because the very next clip drags all 3 of these Bigfoots back together over a fresh kill. And what the elder does with that carcass is going to make you rethink everything you assumed you understood about how these creatures organize themselves. The third clip picks up 11 minutes after the confrontation at camera 4. And by the time it starts, all 3 Bigfoots, the massive one, the younger one, and the elder, have converged around what the drag trail tells me is a fresh deer carcass, dragged in from somewhere off camera. I do not know which one of them made the kill. And honestly, by this point in the footage, it does not matter, because what happens next has nothing to do with who caught the meal and everything to do with who decides what happens to it. The elder moves to the carcass first, and the other 2 hold position, several feet back, and simply wait. I want to emphasize how unnatural that restraint looks on a body that size. The massive Bigfoot, easily the strongest thing in frame, could tear into that deer and have half of it consumed before the other 2 took a single step. It does not. It stands there, arms loose at its sides, watching the elder work. The younger Bigfoot mirrors the posture almost exactly, a few feet further back, patient in a way that reads as learned behavior rather than instinct. Bigfoot, waiting its turn. Bigfoot, respecting a process I did not know existed until this exact moment. The elder begins dividing the carcass, not tearing chaotically, not gorging, but working through it with hands that clearly know the anatomy, separating it into 3 distinct portions with what looks like real intent behind every motion. One portion, clearly the largest, gets set slightly apart. A second, noticeably smaller, gets placed beside it. A third, the smallest by a wide margin, stays closest to where the elder itself is kneeling. I paused here and measured against the tree trunks in frame for scale more than once, because I needed to be sure I was not imagining proportions that fit a narrative too neatly. I was not imagining it. Bigfoot portioning meat by some internal logic that produces 3 unequal, deliberate shares. Then the elder does something that, out of everything on this card, might be the single detail I keep coming back to at 2 in the morning when I cannot sleep. It slides the largest portion across the dirt toward the massive Bigfoot. Not tosses it, not drags it carelessly. Slides it, controlled, the way you would push a plate across a table to someone sitting across from you. The massive Bigfoot does not move until the portion has come to a full stop in front of it. Only then does it reach down and take it. The medium portion goes next, slid with the same deliberate control toward the younger Bigfoot, who shows the identical restraint, waiting for the slide to finish before claiming its share. The elder keeps the smallest portion for itself. Nobody grabs and nobody growls. Nobody so much as leans forward early. 3 Bigfoots gathered around one kill, each one waiting on a system that assigns portions according to some rule I cannot fully decode from a trail camera 90 yards up a drainage, but a rule, unmistakably, that all 3 of them already know and already accept without a shred of resistance. This is not a scramble for calories. This is not survival of the pushiest. Bigfoot has a distribution system, and every member of this group, powerful or small, ancient or young, defers to it without complaint. I have covered a lot of strange footage over the years on this show, but I want to be honest with you. Watching that meat slide across the dirt, watching 2 enormous creatures wait their turn like it was the most natural thing in the world, is the closest I have ever come to feeling like I was watching a courtroom instead of a forest. And if you think that comparison is a stretch, wait until you see what this same elder does 2 days later when it finds something in these woods that should not exist, and turns straight to my camera to make sure I understood exactly what it found. The next relevant clip on the card is dated 2 days after the carcass footage. Same camera, same general stretch of ridge, and it opens on something that made my chest go tight before Bigfoot even entered the frame. A white-tailed doe, maybe 110 pounds, is thrashing against a steel cable snare rigged low between 2 saplings. Clearly a poacher's setup, illegal on federal land, the kind of thing our local wildlife office has been chasing all season without much luck. The doe is exhausted, sides heaving, one leg cinched at an angle that turns my stomach. I am watching this thinking, I am about to log evidence for a game warden. I am not prepared for who walks into frame next. The elder appears from the tree line, moving with that same slow, rolling gait, and stops several feet from the trapped deer. There is no panic in the approach, no rush, nothing that reads as impulsive. Bigfoot studies the scene first, head tilted, gaze tracking down the length of cable, up along the anchor point, back to the animal thrashing against it. This is not the behavior of something reacting on instinct. This is observation, assessment. The elder is reading the mechanism the way an engineer might read a jammed piece of equipment before deciding how to fix it, and I have never watched an animal do that on any card I have pulled in 15 years of running cameras. Bigfoot traces the cable with one hand, following the line from the doe's leg all the way back to where it is lashed around the base of a sapling, acting as the anchor. It grips that sapling, tests it once with a light pull, and then, without any wasted motion, twists. One deliberate rotation of the wrist and forearm, and the anchor snaps clean at the base. The tension releases instantly. The doe bolts the second the cable goes slack, crashing off through the brush so fast the camera barely catches the blur of her. The elder does not chase, does not react to the noise, does not even turn to watch her go. Bigfoot already has its attention on something else entirely. The ruined trap lying coiled in the dirt. What happens over the next 90 seconds is the reason I am recording this episode at all. The elder gathers up the broken length of cable and the metal anchor stake still wired to it, and it carries both pieces, carefully, almost ceremonially, directly toward my trail camera. It lays the cable down first, then the stake beside it, arranging them into a straight line pointed at the lens with a precision that cannot be accidental. I have gone frame by frame through this sequence more times than I can count, and there is no version of it that reads as random debris dumping. Bigfoot is staging evidence. Bigfoot is building an exhibit. Then it steps back from the arrangement, squares its body directly to the camera housing, and looks straight into the lens. Not past it, not near it, directly into the glass, the way you would look at another person across a table when you needed them to understand you were serious. It raises one arm and points, first at the snare lying in the dirt, then swings that same arm around and points squarely at the camera itself. The message could not be clearer if it had been typed across the bottom of the screen. This trap, your device. I know both belong to your kind. What comes next is the moment I had to step outside my truck and just breathe for a minute before I could keep working. The elder draws one hand slowly across its own throat, a single unmistakable cutting gesture, and holds that pose. Not a flinch of emotion, a held gesture sustained for a full 3 seconds by my frame count, eyes locked on the lens the entire time. Then it lowers the arm, turns, and walks unhurried back into the timber, leaving the broken snare laid out in that deliberate line. For whoever came to check the card next, that was me. I was the one it left that message for, whether it knew that or not, and I have not been able to shake it since. I need you to understand what that sequence actually contains, laid out piece by piece, because I do not think we say it plainly enough. Bigfoot recognized a human-made object. Bigfoot understood that a mechanical trap required a specific method to disable, and executed that method correctly on the first attempt. Bigfoot recognized my camera as belonging to the same species responsible for the snare. Bigfoot then constructed a physical arrangement of evidence, positioned it deliberately for the camera to record, and delivered a threat gesture aimed directly at whoever would eventually watch this footage. That is not animal behavior. That is not instinct, and it is not coincidence stacked on coincidence. That is a warning issued across species, and it was issued to me. I called a friend who runs trapping enforcement for the county the next morning before I had even slept, and described the anchor mechanism frame by frame without telling him what had disabled it. He confirmed what I suspected. That particular twist and snap release on a green sapling anchor is not something you stumble into by luck. It is a specific technique, one that requires understanding torque, understanding where the wood is likely to fail under rotational stress rather than straight line pulling, and understanding that a straight pull against a snare anchor usually just tightens the whole system further instead of releasing it. Most people who set up field snares for a living do not even know that failure point exists. Bigfoot found it in under 10 seconds on the first attempt without any visible trial and error. That single detail changed how I understood everything else on the card, because it meant this was not the first trap the elder had ever encountered. Somewhere out on that ridge, across however many years this creature has walked it, Bigfoot has run into human snares before, learned exactly how they fail, and carried that knowledge forward the same way any of us would carry a skill we picked up the hard way. I thought that snare footage was the peak of what this card could deliver. I thought nothing left on that memory chip could top a 9-foot elder staring down my lens with a threat gesture held for 3 full seconds. I was wrong, because the very last file on the card is not more forest footage at all. It's the moment everything I just described finally caught up with me, sitting alone in my truck at midnight, and I understood exactly what these 3 Bigfoots have actually been doing on this ridge the whole time. I watched the snare clip 9 times in a row before I could make myself stop. Then I went back and watched the trade at camera 2 again, and the mediation at camera 4, and the carcass division, and by the 3rd full pass through all 4 clips. Back to back, I was not thinking about Bigfoot as a cryptid anymore, not thinking about this the way I have thought about every prior podcast episode I have ever recorded. I was thinking about what kind of society produces this specific sequence of behavior in this specific order, across 4 days, on one stretch of ridge. Bigfoot, across every single clip on this card, was not behaving like an animal reacting to stimulus. Bigfoot was behaving like a citizen operating inside a system. Run it back with me piece by piece, because the pattern only fully lands once you stack it. First, an economy. 2 Bigfoots trading berries for meat, an even exchange freely offered and freely accepted. No coercion on either side. Second, a government, or at minimum a recognized chain of authority. A younger Bigfoot appealing to an elder for intervention, and a massive, physically dominant Bigfoot yielding to that elder's single touch without a moment of resistance. Third, a justice system, that same elder dividing a kill into 3 unequal but clearly reasoned portions, sliding each share across the dirt with total control, and 2 much larger, much stronger creatures waiting patiently for a process neither of them tried to shortcut. And fourth, something that goes even further than any of that, a legal framework. Bigfoot recognizing a human tool, understanding its function well enough to disable it, gathering the components as physical evidence, and delivering that evidence directly to a recording device with a gesture that only means one thing. That is not a monster story anymore, and if you came into this episode expecting one, I understand, because I did too. This is a story about contact, about a group of Bigfoots that appear to run their own economy, defer to their own elders, distribute resources according to a system every member honors without force, and have concluded, correctly it turns out, that the best way to communicate a grievance to humans is through the exact device humans use to watch them. The cutting gesture at the end of that snare clip was not a threat thrown out in blind rage. It was measured, held for a precise 3 seconds, delivered directly to the lens, and then the elder simply walked away. Message sent, point made, no further violence required. Bigfoot did not need to destroy my camera to prove it understood exactly what that camera was. The first hiker was Mark Devlin, a former Marine, cocky as they come, the kind of guy who laughed at trail warnings taped to the ranger station door. He was alone, boots off, wading through the shallows of a river that cuts through 11 miles of dense timber where 3 other hikers had already gone missing that season. Missing under circumstances everyone now understands were caused by Bigfoot. The trail cam I'm looking at is bolted to a pine about 40 yards upstream, angled low across the water. You can see Mark splashing around, laughing to himself, completely unaware that Bigfoot is already in the river with him. That's the part that gets me every time I run this footage back. Bigfoot isn't approaching. Bigfoot is already there, submerged, patient, waiting in water that should be too cold and too shallow for anything that size to hide in. The water behind Mark rises, and it isn't a wave. It's a shape, darker than the riverbed, wider than any black bear that's ever been logged in this state, a hump of matted fur breaking the surface tension like a boulder learning to swim. Bigfoot doesn't roar. Bigfoot doesn't charge. It simply reaches up from beneath the current and closes a hand the size of a dinner plate around Mark's ankle. He goes under like a dropped stone. 3 seconds of thrashing, a burst of white foam, one hand clawing at the air, and then the river swallows the whole scene. The water goes still so fast, it's like the incident never happened, like Bigfoot wiped the record clean the second it was finished. The evidence they found afterward is what convinced even the skeptics on the search team. Mark's backpack, shredded clean through the nylon straps, was hanging from a low branch 20 feet upstream. 20 feet upstream against the current, which means Bigfoot carried it there before doubling back for the body. Inside the bag, his wallet sat untouched, cash still folded, ID still tucked in its sleeve. His phone was still recording audio from inside a side pocket. On that audio, underneath the gurgle of moving water, there's a wet, splintering crack that the coroner later matched to a femur fracture. A bone snapped the way you'd snap a breadstick, mid-limb, no hesitation. The most chilling detail wasn't the sound. It was the drag marks on the far bank, gouged 4 inches deep into wet clay, dragging in a straight line for nearly 60 yards before stopping dead at a sheer rock face. No footprints continuing past that point, no body recovered, then or ever. Just a wide smear where a slab of moss had been torn away in one violent motion, as if Bigfoot had gone vertical, scaling stone with a full-grown man clenched somewhere against its body and simply climbed out of the search radius entirely. I went back through 11 minutes of footage before that attack, hoping to find some earlier sign of Bigfoot in the frame, some warning the trail cam caught that Mark never saw. There isn't one. No ripple, no shadow crossing the far bank, nothing. Whatever Bigfoot is, it can hold itself completely motionless in cold current for the better part of an hour without disturbing a single reed on the bank, and that kind of discipline doesn't belong to an animal reacting to hunger. That belongs to something running a strategy. Divers went into that river 2 days later, looking for Mark's remains, and came up with nothing but a single boot, still laced, wedged 8 feet down between 2 boulders that hadn't shifted position in decades, according to the old survey maps. The boot had puncture marks through the leather, 4 of them, spaced in a pattern that matched nothing on record for any North American predator. Bigfoot had bitten straight through hardened hiking leather like it was cardboard, and it had done it while still holding a grown man underwater with the other hand. I thought that was the whole story. I thought, okay, a freak territorial attack, an animal defending a stretch of river. But that theory died 3 hours later when the second trail cam lit up, because it proved Bigfoot wasn't defending anything at all. Bigfoot was collecting. You ever see a woman get pulled through the wall of her own tent, like she's nothing but a fish being yanked through a hole in the ice? Well, that's exactly what happened next, and it's worse than the river. The second hiker was Sarah Blumhouse, a solo backpacker who had hiked the Appalachian Trail twice and genuinely believed she'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at a person. She had never accounted for Bigfoot. Her trail cam was a small motion-activated unit clipped inside her tent, angled toward the door flap, a setup meant to catch raccoons rifling through her food bag, not meant to catch Bigfoot reaching in from the outside world to take her. The timestamp reads 9:02 p.m. Sarah is zipped into her sleeping bag, reading by headlamp, murmuring to herself the way solo campers do to keep the silence from feeling so total. Then the nylon wall directly behind her doesn't tear. It peels, smooth and deliberate, the way you'd peel back the skin of a banana, which tells you Bigfoot has done this before, that this is technique and not blind rage. A hand slides through the gap, black, knuckled, knobbed at the joints, tipped with claws like chipped obsidian, and it wraps around her entire torso in one motion. Bigfoot extracts her through that slit without so much as loosening a single tent stake outside. She doesn't get a scream out. One frame she's sitting up reading. The next she's being hauled backward through the wall into freezing dark, her headlamp beam whipping wild arcs across the canvas as she disappears from view. The footprints outside measured 17 inches long and sank nearly 4 inches into packed dirt deep as fresh grave soil. But the footprints weren't even the piece of evidence that broke the case wide open. It was the sleeping bag. When the search party reached the site the next morning, the bag was still lying inside the collapsed tent, except it had been folded neatly, corners squared off, zipper drawn halfway shut, arranged with a strange, almost domestic precision, as if Bigfoot had paused mid-abduction to tidy the scene before vanishing into the tree line with a living person under its arm. Inside that fold, investigators found a single tuft of Sarah's hair, torn out by the root, and a smear of thick saliva that the lab flagged as belonging to no cataloged primate on record. A protein structure that didn't match bear, didn't match wolf, didn't match anything with a name. That's the moment the Forest Service tried to spin this as a bear attack for the press release. But bears don't fold camping gear. Bears don't extract a full-grown adult through a 6-inch gap without leaving a single drop of blood behind. Bigfoot does. There's a second angle on this attack that most people miss the first time through because it's easy to fixate on the tent wall peeling open. About 4 seconds before that peel starts, the trail cam picks up a low vibration in the audio track, a bass rumble that the sound techs later identified as footsteps. Bigfoot's footsteps, landing with such mass that the ground itself was carrying the sound before the creature ever made contact with the canvas. Sarah never reacts to it. She keeps reading. Whatever frequency Bigfoot moves at, it's below what a human ear registers as a threat, which means every one of these 6 hikers had less warning than a single heartbeat before Bigfoot was already on top of them. Search dogs brought to the site the next day refused to cross the tree line past the folded sleeping bag. Every handler on scene described the same reaction, the dogs planting their feet, backing up, refusing food and commands both, as if the scent trail leading into the dark carried something their training had never prepared them to walk toward. One dog broke its leash entirely and bolted back to the trailhead, and it took 3 hours to recover it 2 miles down the mountain, still trembling, still refusing to go near the tree line where Bigfoot had vanished with Sarah under its arm. You want to know what actually keeps me up at night reviewing this footage? The math. 2 hikers taken in under 12 hours on the same ridge by the same creature, and neither scene showed signs of feeding. Bigfoot wasn't eating, Bigfoot was stockpiling, and stockpiling means there was a plan. And if you think a silent ambush through canvas is the worst this thing does, wait until you see what happens when a hiker actually tries to fight back. Fair warning, he becomes the weapon. The hiker was Alex Brennan, young, athletic, armed with bear spray and a flare gun, absolutely convinced that gear alone would be enough to handle whatever the ridge threw at him. His trail cam sat on a tripod near his fire pit, angled to catch his morning routine for a vlog he never got to finish. Timestamp 5:44 a.m. First light barely breaking over the ridge. He's cooking breakfast, laughing at his own jokes about the 17-inch tracks he found the day before, completely unaware that Bigfoot had circled back overnight and was already inside the tree line, 20 feet from where he was standing. This trail cam has captured much more of Bigfoot than I have time to show you in this video. That's why, if you click the link in the description, you can read about everything I have truly found. But I have to warn you, you will never think of Bigfoot the same ever again after reading my findings. Back to Alex now. Bigfoot comes out of that tree line at a full sprint, not a lumbering charge. A sprint, low and fast, closing the 20-foot gap in under 2 seconds. Easily 9 feet at full height, its shoulders wider than the fire pit itself, its fur a matted, rust-dark red that the footage catches rippling with the impact of each stride. Alex sees it first and swings the only weapon within reach, a cast-iron frying pan, directly at its skull. Bigfoot doesn't flinch. It backhands him mid-swing with enough force to send him sideways into a pine trunk so hard the trunk splinters at chest height, bark exploding outward in a spray of white wood chips. Alex tries to crawl. Bigfoot closes the distance in a single stride, grabs him by the left leg, and lifts him fully upside down. A grown man, dangling one-handed off the ground like a rag doll. Then Bigfoot swings him, full arm, into a nearby boulder. The impact registers on the audio as a single dense crunch, and Alex goes limp mid-swing. Bigfoot isn't done. It grabs his collar with the other hand and drags him toward the brush the way a person drags a duffel bag, one fist on the ankle, one fist on the jacket, his body bouncing over rocks and roots the entire way. The evidence at that site told its own story before the search team even opened the file. Beyond the shattered pine, Alex's hiking pole was found driven vertically into the dirt, his cap balanced on top like a small, gruesome flag marking the spot. But the detail that actually stopped the coroner cold was a single tooth, 3 inches long, serrated along one edge, embedded so deep in the split pine bark that it had to be chiseled free. It wasn't a canine. Lab analysis called it a molar. A molar belonging to something that chews before it drags, and wedged in the roots of that molar was a strip of human skin. Bigfoot bites its victims before it ever bothers hauling them off. What most people miss on the first watch is the 11 seconds before Bigfoot ever breaks the tree line. The trail cam catches the branches at the edge of frame, swaying against the wind pattern, moving opposite the direction every other bough on that slope was leaning that morning. Bigfoot was already pacing the perimeter of Alex's camp, long before the frying pan ever came out. Circling, sizing up the terrain, choosing an angle of attack that put the pine trunk directly in Alex's escape path. That's not a startled animal defending territory. That's a hunt with a plan built in before the first move was made. The frying pan itself turned up 9 feet from the fire pit, folded almost in half along its own handle. The cast iron cracked clean through in a spot that should be structurally impossible to break with a bare hand. Rangers who examined it said the fracture pattern matched a force closer to a hydraulic press than any bite or swing, which tells you Bigfoot didn't need momentum to do that kind of damage. It did it standing still, almost as an afterthought, on the way to grabbing Alex by the leg. You think one solo male victim proves a pattern? Day 2 hadn't even started yet, and Bigfoot was already getting creative, because this thing doesn't just grab prey. It plays with it first. The hiker was Jenna Morales, an experienced climber who set her trail cam to watch her own back while she rappelled 70 feet down a sheer granite face, a habit she'd picked up after a rockslide scare the year before. Timestamp 11:22 a.m. She's halfway down the wall, methodically checking her knots, sunlight hitting the rock in sharp white bands, when a shadow the size of a delivery truck blots out the sun directly above her. And that shadow is Bigfoot. Bigfoot doesn't climb down to reach her. It jumps, clearing 30 feet of open rock face in one leap, landing against the vertical granite with claws that punch straight into stone like ice axes. It clings there, spider-like, impossibly balanced on a wall that shouldn't hold a creature that size, and reaches down with one arm to cover Jenna's entire face with a single palm. Her legs kick against open air for a solid 30 seconds. You can count the kicks on the footage, 30 full seconds of a person fighting for her life against a hand that never once loses its grip. And then she goes still. Bigfoot unhooks her carabiner one-handed, slings her limp body over its shoulder, and climbs back up that same vertical face using only its legs and feet, gripping the stone like gecko pads while it carries a full-grown adult the rest of the way up without slowing. At the base of the cliff, searchers found Jenna's water bottle crushed flat. The aluminum spiraled like it had been wrung out by hand. But the piece of evidence that made the front page was her jacket, snagged on a rock horn at the very top of the climb. Inside the pocket, her phone had kept recording the entire time. The final frame on that video isn't the cliff face or the canopy below. It's Bigfoot's face, filling the entire lens from an inch away, inspecting the device with 2 flat yellow irises and no visible pupils, its breath fogging the glass with a cold that shouldn't exist in July. Jenna was never found. The only trace left behind was a single fingernail, hers, cracked and lodged into a crevice at the summit, as if she'd clawed at the bare stone with everything she had left, while Bigfoot carried her off into the canopy without breaking stride. The climbing partner, who was supposed to be waiting at the base, never saw Bigfoot at all. His statement to the rangers said he heard exactly one sound, a low creak like a tree bending under sudden weight, followed by total silence, followed by Jenna's rope going slack and coiling into the dirt with no one attached to the far end. He looked up in time to see nothing but drifting rock dust where Bigfoot had launched off the wall, and by the time he processed what he'd witnessed, the canopy had already closed over the escape route like it had never been disturbed. Rangers rappelled that same face 2 days later to recover gear and found something they hadn't expected. 3 more sets of the same 17-inch prints pressed into a narrow ledge 60 feet up, a ledge with no trail access, no reasonable climbing route, nothing but sheer granite on every side. Bigfoot had been using that ledge as a waypoint, a resting shelf between the valley floor and whatever den it was hauling victims back to, which meant this stretch of cliff wasn't a hunting ground Bigfoot stumbled into. It was a route Bigfoot had already mapped out and used before. That closed out day 1. Day 2 is when Bigfoot got provoked, because now somebody was shooting back at it. Our next hiker was Juan Peñaflor, a lifelong hunter who'd heard the screams echoing off the ridge the night before and made the decision to set up a defensive blind with a high-caliber rifle, fully expecting whatever came out of the fog to go down in one shot. His trail cam faced his own firing position, timestamp 2:15 p.m. Through drifting fog, Bigfoot appears at the tree line, walking slow, upright, deliberate, arms swinging with a weight that makes the branches around it visibly shudder. Juan fires first, a direct center mass hit. Bigfoot doesn't even stagger. The fur along its chest ripples with the impact, and a thick, tar-black substance seeps out where the round entered, but the stride doesn't break. He fires again, then again, working the bolt as fast as his hands allow, emptying the entire magazine into Bigfoot's face and chest at close range. Bigfoot blinks once. That's the entire visible reaction to 6 rounds of high-caliber ammunition. It reaches into the blind, wraps one fist around the rifle barrel, and bends the entire weapon into a tight U-shape with a single flex of its wrist, the same way a person might bend a green twig. Then it takes Juan by the throat, lifts him clean off the ground to eye level, and squeezes. He doesn't struggle for long. The audio catches a series of dense popping cracks as his vertebrae give way one at a time, like someone snapping bubble. Wrap in sequence. The evidence that followed was the most significant find of the entire 2-day period. A blood trail, not Juan's, but Bigfoot's own, dripping from the graze wound where one of those 6 rounds had actually broken skin along its shoulder. Search teams followed that trail for 1.5 miles, straight to a massive granite boulder that had been physically rolled away from a crevice cut into the hillside. A boulder that weighed, by later estimate, somewhere north of 2,000 pounds, moved like it was nothing. Inside that crevice they found bones, dozens of them, deer, black bear, and, confirmed by forensic anthropology, human femurs, stacked deliberately like cordwood along the crevice wall. No skulls anywhere in the pile. Not a single cranium was found among the scattered remains, despite the search team documenting bones from nearly every other part of the human body. Bigfoot keeps the head somewhere else, a detail nobody on the search team has been able to explain, and one that completely changes the way investigators interpret what was actually happening out on that ridge. Whatever purpose the separate placement served, it appeared deliberate rather than accidental, suggesting that the bodies were being handled according to some consistent pattern instead of simply discarded. The blood trail ended right at the crevice mouth, sealed shut again with a fresh smear of black ichor across the narrow seam where the massive boulder had been rolled back into place. Investigators noted that the entrance showed fresh disturbance compared to the surrounding rock, as though it had been opened only hours earlier before being concealed again. It was a den, it was full, and it belonged to Bigfoot. Ballistics later confirmed all 6 rounds Juan fired connected, 3 to the chest, 2 to the shoulder, 1 grazing the jawline, a spread that would drop a full-grown grizzly bear there in seconds. Bigfoot absorbed every one of them and kept walking at the same unbroken pace, which tells you whatever is under that fur isn't built like anything cataloged in a biology textbook. The Forestry Service's own ballistics consultant refused to sign off on a final report, citing, in his own words on record, that the wound pattern was inconsistent with mammalian physiology, and then declined to elaborate further. Inside that crevice den, alongside the stacked femurs, searchers also recovered scraps of fabric from at least 4 different jackets, none of which matched any of the 6 known hikers, meaning Bigfoot's collection predates this 2-day span by a significant margin, and meaning this ridge has been a hunting ground far longer than anyone on the search team wants to admit publicly. One of those jacket scraps still had a zipper pull stamped with a manufacturer's date code that put its original sale nearly 6 years in the past, a detail that made it into an internal memo but never into any public statement, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that Bigfoot had been operating on this exact mountain, undetected, for the better part of a decade before a single trail cam ever caught a frame of it. A forestry biologist who cataloged the crevice contents privately estimated the bone stack represented more than a decade of activity, all of it credited to Bigfoot, all of it kept sealed behind 2,000 pounds of granite until Juan's rifle rounds forced Bigfoot to finally reveal where it had been storing the evidence of every hiker the mountain had quietly lost. That crevice wasn't the end of the count. It was the moment the count stopped being sick. You want to know what Bigfoot actually does with them once they're taken? The forestry scientists floated theories for months after the earlier disappearances. Some believed the victims were being hidden and saved for later feeding. Others suggested some kind of hibernation cache where bodies were stored in remote mountain shelters until winter. A few researchers even argued the behavior resembled ritualistic caching seen in certain intelligent animals, though nobody could explain why. Every theory sounded unbelievable, yet every one of them was considered because there simply wasn't a better explanation. Then the 6th trail cam answered every single question at once, and I promise you, you will wish it hadn't. Instead of solving one mystery, it opened several more that investigators spent years trying to explain, and it still wasn't the last file the Iowa Forest Service had to open that week. This is the one the Forest Service tried hardest to keep out of the public file. Even among investigators who had already reviewed the previous recordings, this was the footage that several reportedly refused to watch a second time. The hiker was Min Park, hiking solo, and he had the foresight, or the bad luck, to set up a trail cam facing directly into his own tent from about 10 feet away. He wanted to capture any wildlife wandering through camp overnight while also documenting his trip for himself. The camera had a clear, unobstructed view of the tent entrance and enough infrared illumination to record almost every movement after dark. He was inside, reading by headlamp, occasionally shifting in his sleeping bag as the forest remained completely still around him, when Bigfoot came crashing out of the underbrush. Every previous attack on this footage had been quiet, controlled, almost surgical. The creature had moved with deliberate patience, avoiding unnecessary noise until the exact moment it struck. This one wasn't. Bigfoot came in screaming, a deep, guttural infrasonic wail that cracks the trail cam's microphone and distorts the entire audio track into harsh static for nearly half a second before the recording finally clears. Even after the sound stabilizes, the microphone continues clipping from the sheer volume of the vocalization as the creature barrels straight toward the tent without slowing down. Min bolts upright and out of the tent flap holding a hatchet, the only weapon he'd brought. He swings hard, aiming for the head. Bigfoot catches his forearm mid-swing and with a single twist of its wrist rips the entire arm off at the shoulder. Not a tear, a full separation. The same motion you'd use pulling a drumstick off a roasted chicken. Min drops screaming, blood spraying in a wide arc across the tent canvas. Bigfoot doesn't lift him this time. It drops to all fours over his body, pins him flat against the dirt with one enormous forearm, and goes to work. I've run this footage more than 40 times trying to catalog every second of it, and it never gets easier to watch. Bigfoot doesn't kill him quickly. It bites down into his torso and shakes him the way a dog shakes a rag doll, crushes his pelvis flat with a single downward stomp, and then, while Min is still twitching, still alive by every visible measure, it uses its claws to open his abdomen and draw out his intestines, wrapping the length of them around one closed fist like a plate of spaghetti. Min stops moving roughly 90 seconds into the attack. Bigfoot keeps working for another 4 full minutes, pulverizing bone with its own weight, scattering torn tissue in a wide radius around the collapsed tent, before finally scooping the remains into a single bundle, tucking it under one arm, and walking calmly back into the tree line like the entire event had cost it nothing. The evidence recovered at that campsite told the whole grim story on its own. The hatchet was found bent completely in half. Kevin's headlamp was still switched on, lens coated in a pale gray paste the lab confirmed as brain matter. His left hand, severed clean at the wrist, was still locked around a thick tuft of Bigfoot's own fur, ripped free during the struggle. The single clearest DNA sample recovered from the entire 2-day span. But the piece of evidence that ended every internal debate at the Forest Service was the trail cam itself. It had been knocked flat, its lens cracked down the middle, but it kept recording audio for 2 full minutes after the picture went dark. 2 minutes of wet, rhythmic crunching before the stomping finally resumes and fades off into the trees. That crunching is what sent search teams back to Juan's crevice within the week, and this time there was nothing to find. 2,000 pounds of granite gone, rolled off to some new position the ground-penetrating radar couldn't map. Bigfoot had already relocated the den before anyone thought to check it twice. The bone stack, picked clean, was gone with it, but the dogs at Min's site weren't done working. 12 feet from the collapsed tent, under 6 inches of disturbed soil, one of them turned up a second set of remains. And this set wasn't new. Those remains were badly weathered, partial, and matched through dental records to a hiker who'd been logged as missing more than 4 years earlier, long before this 2-day span ever began. The bone damage on that older set was identical to Min's. Same crush pattern on the pelvis, same twisting fracture at the shoulder joint where a limb had been separated whole. That makes 7 confirmed matches to the same set of jaws, not 6, and the forestry biologist cataloging the crevice never got to finish her count. 2 days after she filed her preliminary notes, a second trail cam, one she'd staked half a mile east on her own time, at the mouth of a crevice she hadn't even logged with the department yet, caught movement, upright, 17 inches to a stride, moving away from her position, not toward it, which her field notes flagged as the only mercy in the entire case file. Bigfoot didn't discover this ridge 2 days before Mark waded into that river. Bigfoot has been working this exact stretch of mountain for years, quietly, methodically, long before a single trail cam was ever mounted to catch it in the act. And the count keeps moving. Every fresh set of prints logged since Min's site has walked a slightly different line than the last, never repeating a den once it's been found, never circling back to ground that's already been searched. Somewhere on that ridge right now, there's a 7th trail cam nobody has pulled footage from yet, strapped to a tree by a hiker who has no idea that something already knows exactly where that camera is mounted and exactly when the battery light stops blinking red. 6 families are still waiting on remains that were never recovered, and a 7th family, older, quieter, filed as closed 4 years before anyone thought to reopen it, is only now learning their hiker belongs on this same list. The Forest Service hasn't released the location of that second unlogged crevice. The biologist who found it hasn't been back to check it, and every ranger working that district will tell you off the record that the mountain isn't finished because the prints keep moving, the dens keep emptying out ahead of every search party that finds them, and somewhere past the last known ridge line, there's a trail cam still rolling, patiently waiting to catch whoever walks past it next.